We're going to start.
No, that's not the. Here we go. G'day, May 40 here. So I love power. How about you? How do you like power? Right? It's better to have power than not to have power. And in my spare time, I prefer to do those things that make me feel powerful rather than those things that make me feel like an idiot. So if you most feel powerful by writing smack in the chat, all right, you will be incentivized to spend much of your spare time writing smack in the chat. If what makes you feel powerful is sponsoring people in your favorite 12-step program, or leading the prayers at your synagogue or your church, then you'll spend much of your spare time practicing your religion. What makes you feel powerful is publishing scientific papers or playing chess at the beach. All right, we all tend to do that which makes us feel powerful. Right? We are driven by this need to feel powerful and to feel pride. And universally, we tend to feel pride at about a 0.66 rate according to how much other people value us. So we have evolved towards producing those abilities that those around us value, and we tend to take pride according to how much value that we add to other people. We're evolved to live socially, to live tribally, and you can't really generate your own pride. You can't effectively generate your own self-esteem. How you feel about yourself, how strong you feel, how much pride you feel will be strongly correlated with how much you contribute, how much you've got to offer to people around you. And it seems like a great topic for scientific research, but the academy doesn't really delve into power very much. Doesn't delve that much into status, right? To have power is to be higher status than to lack power. So it's curious, like, why doesn't the academy get into issues like this? And so much of life, we have to look to, say, stand-up comics to talk to us in a real way, as opposed to academics. This is
I was walking over here, and I guess I had a stern look on my face because this guy looked at me and said, "Don't hurt nobody now." So I stabbed him. I got married, and thank you, 10 years ago. I am divorced now. I got divorced right after Biden was inaugurated. So now that Trump is president, I think I'm going to meet the love of my life. Maybe we'll meet in a gulag, or I don't know, maybe we'll have the same shift on the cotton field. I don't know. I'm joking. There's not going to be shifts, you guys. I was in an interracial marriage. I'm black, and he was a software engineer at Google. He was white. He was hard H white. He was white. He was really white. His middle name is DeBlanc. So if you know French, you know DeBlanc means all lives matter. And that's a family name. His great-great-great-great-grandfather was Jean-Maximilien Alcibiades d'Urneville de Blanc. Around town, he was...
So why do I do so many live streams, podcasts, right? So much on my blog? Because it makes me feel powerful, right? We tend to do that which we're good at. And when we're good at something, right, that tends to give us more enthusiasm, more energy, more commitment. And then the more energy and commitment, dedication we put in something, better we get. And then at least in that tiny little world, we develop a little bit more status. So power and status are situational. So Trump and the Republicans were unified on this shutdown because they knew they had the power, right? The precedent for a clean CR, a continuing resolution, right, had known no exceptions over the past 15 years. So they knew that eventually enough Democrats would cave. 2024, most Americans had experienced that they were worse off under President Biden. And so that placed Trump and the Republicans in a powerful position in that situation. Right? Power always depends on the situation. In the COVID chaos of 2020, Trump and the Republicans were the underdogs because the dominant issues like healthcare, right, played to the left's favor. So when you have chaos, then that usually plays the advantage of a right-wing party that promises to restore law and order. Then when they do that, crime declines. People become much more relaxed about discipline, about standards, about punishment, about broken windows, policing, everything that protects order. And then that breeds more chaos. So the world's a dangerous, complicated place. And as someone with a skeptical view of human nature, I see chaos lurking behind every single form of order. Right? I'm always expecting chaos to overwhelm my world, your world, this world. And it's just my reflex is to fear chaos and to fear disorder probably more than anything else. And each day that order holds, right, I feel gratitude. I don't take order for granted. I think people are animals, not just animals, but they have a substantial element component. And I recognize that in nature, life is red in tooth and claw. That in nature, without the discipline of order and civilization and government, right, life tends to be nasty, brutish, and short. And the Jewish tradition speaks to me. There's a text in Ethics of the Fathers, which is a Mishnah from about 2,000 years ago, where a rabbi says, "Pray for the welfare of the government, for were it not for fear of it, men would swallow one another alive." So I can't sign on to that Reagan anti-government instinct that the government's the worst thing and the best thing is to reduce the size of government. I can't sign on to Dennis Prager's analysis that the bigger the government, the smaller the citizen. When you decode that, there's absolutely no difference in the size of the citizen, whether we spend twice as much on national parks or twice as much on defense or on social security or on health or on education or spend half as much. It doesn't shape the size of the citizen. Among the major economies of the world, I believe the French have a higher percentage of government spending as a percentage of their GDP. And I don't think that the French are particularly made smaller and diminished. Right? It strikes me that most French are pretty happy and proud of their distinctive French way of life. So I love the unromantic, unsentimental perspective on human nature in Judaism, that we should have gratitude for authority, because we should recognize that authority is what protects us, that without the threat of hierarchy and authority, chaos is going to win. In Genesis chapter 8, verse 21, after the flood, God says, "The imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth." All right, what a stark acknowledgement of human nature. Right, people are driven by appetite, by fear, by pride, by lust, by envy, and only external constraints, law, ritual, authority, hierarchy, right, keep us from tearing each other apart. Now, you go to the academy, and the more elite you go in America's universities and the developing world's universities, especially in the social sciences and the humanities, the more optimism you find about human nature, the more environmental determinism, right? The more people are seen as basically malleable, simply corrupted by capitalism and by these right-wing medieval constructs rather than by their innate impulses. So the biblical view, the traditional view, is that evil and chaos is normal, natural, and it comes from within us, so that the imagination of man is evil from his youth, and civilization tames us, that we start out wild, and then civilization makes us better. The academic perspective is that evil exists primarily outside of us. It comes from bad institutions, from inequality, from capitalism, from evil right-wingers, from social conditioning, from trauma. If you just fix the environment, then people improve. If you remove children as much as possible from their parents and restore them to the rule of social workers and those with graduate degrees in education, then life will get better. From the traditional perspective, the biblical perspective, the realist perspective, order, civilization, these things are artificial. These things are precious. These things depend upon hierarchy, authority, punishment. And all punishment contains a considerable element of vengeance. And from a trad perspective, right, punishing with an element of vengeance is A-okay. From the academic left-wing buffered enlightened perspective, order should arise naturally from within us, from within our buffered identity, where we use our autonomous rational faculties, our ability to reason and to empathize and to talk to other people. And once we remove hierarchy and oppression, then our natural desires for reason will just overflow. Very different perspective on human nature.
He was just known as Chad. And He was actually the founder of the Knights of the White Camellia, which was a white supremacist terrorist organization in Louisiana. So I think my husband married me mainly out of guilt. It was like at least 3/5 of the reason why he married me. So when we got married, I quit my job because reparations, And every morning he'd go to work and I'd sleep all day and I'd be like, who's the slave now, bitch? Yeah, it felt really good. We actually met at work. I worked at Google for a while and they didn't know I was black there. My manager IM'd me once and he was like, Sarah, we're doing the diversity report. Is it okay if we say that you're black? I said, I am black. And he said, oh great, even better.
So up until the 1960s, it was easier to identify with the majority, and it was easier to shun status as a victim. But since the 60s, victimhood status has risen in prominence. There are more and more rewards for being a victim, and there are more and more rewards for siding with the coalition of the fringes as against the white Christian center of the United States. So Barack Obama could have chosen to identify as cosmopolitan or anything other than black. He chose to identify as black because that was his best route to power and status. So in different situations, all sorts of people would either identify as black or not identify as black, depending on the incentives.
I think they thought I was Indian because they kept promoting me. My ex, he kept asking me out, and I kept saying no. I wasn't scared of dating a coworker. I was scared of dating a third coworker. I was an office slut, you could say, but if I was a man, they would call me a high performer. So that's what I think, yeah. And I think it's good when you meet a guy at work. If you meet a guy at work, you know he has a job. And if he doesn't text you back, you know where he works. You know which bathroom stall he's in. So he kept asking me out, and finally he said he had tickets to see Louis C.K., who was my favorite comedian at the time. So
I was dating this Jewish woman. She was the landlord of a friend of mine, and I think she emailed me, right? This is back when people would email more than text. And I didn't get back to her right away because a non-Jewish woman took advantage of my naivete. And so I kind of got caught up in her. And as soon as I didn't text this Jewish woman back right away, she immediately knew our dating trajectory had finished. So what's that new Netflix show about a rabbi dating a podcaster? Nobody likes you. What is it? I
couldn't say no to that. You can't say no to Louis C.K. That's his whole brand. That's a sexual harassment joke wrapped inside another sexual harassment joke. It's pretty deep. I'm Jamaican, and people don't believe me when I say I'm Jamaican. They're like,
so all sorts of Jamaicans who are proud that they are not black, right? They become black when they move to America and the incentives change. So in their native land, right, there's more status in saying that they're not black, right? If they pass the brown paper bag test, but then they move to America, incentives change, and they come out as black. So nobody wants this. It's a hilarious Netflix show. It's just really funny. It's just really well written. It's not cliche. I don't know what the characters are about to say or do. It is a lot of fun. And in the second season, the rabbi, he quits his job at the establishment temple. He has a job interview at a more progressive temple. And the night before the interview, he just wants a night off from his girlfriend. And she doesn't take it well. And so afterwards, she makes him swear he will never again ask for a night off. Rather, he has to phrase it as this terrible, sad, awful necessity of a night away from you. But yeah, we take rejection very, very personally. Nobody wants this. I mean, that's a hilarious show. It's big hit on Netflix for very good reasons, right? Reform rabbi dates a non-Jewish sex podcaster.
Do you like Bob Marley? Do you smoke weed? And I'm like, are you trying to figure out if I'm Jamaican or a white dude named Craig? And I actually have a lot in common with white dudes named Craig, and I don't like it. I went on a date with one, and he was like, I used to work in tech. And I'm like, yeah, me too. He's like, I'm doing comedy now. Me too. I had a Jamaican nanny growing up, and I'm like, yeah, me too. It was my mom. But I have a lot of like, colonizer energy is what people say about me. I think it's my parents' fault for naming me Sarah. Like, I think when they named me Sarah, the ghost of a basic bitch named Sarah moved into my body and gentrified my personality. Because when I was little, my mom would cook jerk chicken, and I'd be like, Mom, this jerk chicken is like really spicy.
I wonder if I'd be a different person if I had a different name than Luke. There's something about Luke Ford that just puts you on a certain path in life.
And she'd be like, Sarah's jerk chicken is supposed to be spicy. And I'd be like, yeah, but Mom, my mouth is on fire right now. It is literally on fire. And she'd get so mad. She'd be like, Sarah, you know that children around the world, all they get for dinner is bread and water. And I'd be like, bread and water actually sounds really good right now, Mom.
I remember around 1983, I was watching 60 Minutes program with my parents, and there was a segment on the hard lives of illegal immigrants into America from Mexico. And the narrator said that their diets consisted largely of rice and beans. I turned to my parents and said, that's what our diets consist of, right? Nothing wrong with rice and beans prepared well. So the academic view and the trad view on human nature is dramatically different, right? So from the trad view, right, humans can never become perfect, right? Humans will always be vulnerable to the natural passions, and you need constant restraint, constant threat of punishment, exclusion, right? You need hierarchy, you need community, because it's very easy to convince yourself that what you're doing is A-okay. It's very difficult to convince your traditional community that what you're doing is A-okay. Now, from the secular, elite, enlightened, Buffett perspective, with enough education, enough therapy, enough progressive reform, right, people can be re-engineered into these cooperative beings. From the traditional biblical realist point of view, power is absolutely necessary to hold chaos at bay. You need hierarchy, you need punishment, you need to discriminate. There's no civilization without discrimination. From the academic, left-wing, secular, enlightened perspective, power is the root of injustice. Power must be decentralized. Power must be problematized. Right? This is why so much of academic theory just sounds so stupid, so naive, particularly to those of us with a tragic sense of life. Right? It assumes that if you dissolve hierarchy, discrimination, authority, people will just spontaneously organize into goodness, fairness, communal living, harmony, sharing. And they won't. So I want a replacement for Obamacare, but I want Trumpcare modeled on Vouch nationalism, where we form communities where we hold each other accountable. So from a trad perspective, if you dissolve authority, discrimination, hierarchy, you get the flood, you get chaos. So the Buffett enlightened secular elite view trusts innate human goodness and blames systems, right? The trad view distrusts the human impulse, and it builds systems and protects systems and venerates systems and civilizations and discrimination to contain it. And I think history and reality tends to vindicate the more skeptical view of human nature. So why on earth do academics, right, why some of the smartest people in our civilization have the stupidest, most optimistic views of human nature? Because it serves as the moral foundation of their hero system. It is the moral foundation of the modern university. Because when scholars believe that knowledge, reason, communication, in other words, their work product, their papers, when scholars believe that their work papers can improve society, that the pen is mightier than the sword, right? Without that faith, the academic enterprise as we know it would lose its moral license. So what went into this, from my perspective, a deranged perspective, right? Much of it came from the Enlightenment, that we're going to replace religious control, theological pessimism with belief in human progress through the power of reason. that humans are just infinitely improvable if we just strip away the ignorance. So this is the difference between the mutation view and the strip away view. So from my trad perspective, the modern dominant woke left-wing moral universe is a mutation of a secularized form of Protestantism, while from within the secularized, buffered, enlightened identity within that particular hero system, they see themselves as a secularized form of Protestantism, but without the ignorance, without the stupidity, without the bitterness, without the medieval aspects. So they think they've just stripped away the bad things of religion. And from my perspective, they've simply mutated the Protestant impulse. So in Protestantism, like in the secular, enlightened, buffered perspective, the individual is the focus. And in Protestantism, it's individual salvation. And in the secular enlightened view, it's the individual can naturally unleash his innate goodness and reason and autonomy once we strip away the bad, medieval, bitter clinging to guns and religion.
Yeah, if I could get a scone and a chai tea latte, that would be amazing. That would be amazing. Yeah. I didn't know I was Black for a long time. This is my coming out story. I moved here when I was 3, and I found out I was Black when I was 8 years old. I was walking home from the bus stop with my best friend Stacy, who was Jewish. She still is. And these white high school kids drove by and yelled out the N-word at us. And I turned to Stacy and I was like, how could they call you that? And she was like, they weren't talking to me. Who are they talking?
So the identical thing will happen to two people and they will react completely differently, right? Some people take things very personally. I love that phrase, story, anecdote. 2 men looked out from prison bars. One saw mud and another saw stars. Right, right now, as I experience it, 80% of people that I encounter and have an opinion on AI, they hate AI. And they are very eager to tell me all the problems with AI. No matter what happens, they continually just grab onto all the things that are wrong with AI. And there's a recession coming, and we're in an AI bubble, and people are committing suicide because they're falling in love with their chatbots. And so they block out all the positive parts of AI, while I, with my sunny, optimistic Susie Sunshine attitude, I block out all the negative parts of AI. But yeah, man, it's intense out there trying to have any conversation about AI. People just have a visceral fear and loathing of it. So why do academics have such an optimistic view of human nature? And there's a difference here between Judaism and Christianity. Traditional Judaism, traditional Christianity share a skeptical view of human nature. But Judaism, even traditional Judaism, has a much more optimistic view of human nature's potential, that there is goodness latent inside of us. So after World War II, right, intellectuals needed a new narrative that made Western civilization redeemable. They couldn't face the idea that slaughter and genocide was just latent in ordinary people, so they blamed ideology and propaganda instead of nature. They wanted to diminish the realm of the political. They wanted to reduce incentives for politicians to campaign on matters of race and identity and immigration. They wanted more and more power in the hands of experts, those who would pose as disinterested, just wanting the best for everyone. And so we've had a steady decline in the realm of the political since essentially the 30 Years' War, when Protestants and Catholics were slaughtering each other in 17th century Germany. And so a lot of the things we believe, things that are not true, they just make us feel better. Academics have a professional incentive to believe in the perfectibility of human nature. It's very hard to get anyone to convince something if understanding it will destroy their income, right? So academics depend on the idea that their work, their research, their publications, their education, their dialogue makes people better. So a tragic or realistic anthropology would recognize that their work at best only tinkers at the edges, and that our impulses, our animal nature, our power, our fear, our conflict will always rule. So optimism keeps the grants flowing and the moral prestige flowing. Also, Western elites love secular therapeutic culture. They've replaced sin and duty with health and empathy. So on the right, you have more of an emphasis on do your duty. On the left, you have more of an individualist emphasis on follow your bliss. So the dominant left-wing, buffered, enlightened ethic sees pathology, where order systems saw evil. So from a secular perspective, people aren't evil or bad, they're just wounded, and we need institutions to heal them. We need social workers. We don't need police to restrain and punish and criminalize people. We just need to retrain people. So optimism also flatters the ruling class. If human nature is good, then our problems can be increasingly solved through expertise, through management, through education. So from a left-wing perspective, the worst things in life are ignorance and lack of education. While from a traditional right-wing perspective, the worst things in life are chaos and disorder and lack of hierarchy and lack of discrimination. So from a right-wing perspective, the good life is only achieved by making very hard decisions about punishment, hierarchy, and exclusion. So the Academy's optimism is not just an idea, it's a necessity. It's a survival strategy. They justify their own existence. They get to shield themselves from the darker truths that civilization rests on: coercion, discrimination, competition, hierarchy, punishment, vengeance. Right? To admit reality would mean rethinking everything that they stand for. And so during the shutdown, underneath all the rhetoric and the verbiage, right, Trump and the Republicans were remarkably unified because they knew they had the power. They knew they would win, and in time, enough Democrats would cave. So it's a lot easier to be unified when you have the power. So Republicans were unified. They projected that certainty publicly, internally. They knew they'd outlast the Democrats, and that shaped what happened, right? The Democrats fractured. They could not align around any single narrative. They kept trying to campaign on principle versus the evil pragmatism of Republicans. And in the end, the party with the most power won. And there is really only one side of the political spectrum that is queasy about power, and that's the liberal side. If you're trad, if you're right wing, if you're a nationalist or a tribalist, you're pretty comfortable with power, hierarchy, vengeance, punishment, discrimination. These are all essential to have any decency and civilization. Any good things in life depends on these things. But liberals don't want to say that they want power, right? They all talk about stewardship. They'll talk about service, right? They'll sound like a Protestant minister. They don't want to say that they love dominating, they love enforcing. But every type of life naturally gravitates towards constructing its own niche to make it more favorable to them and to those like them. Niche construction, right? That's how life works. From the lowest forms of life to the most elevated forms of life, we're all trying to reconstruct the world around us to make it more favorable for ourselves and for our posterity, right? So when you recognize the biological evolutionary reality of niche construction, that every form of life is reconstructing the world around it, then you have to admit that power is good, power is adaptive, hierarchy, punishment, vengeance, discrimination, these are all necessary for order. And fleeing from power is like fleeing from life itself.
Too. It was like that Spider-Man meme with the two Spider-Mans pointing at each other, and I went home to my parents and I was like, Mama, Papa, I think I'm black. And they were like, no man, we're Jamaican. And I was like, I think you're black too. I think we're all black. You know, I learned.
So Obama was most comfortable around people like him, right? Highly educated, mixed race people who in a different set of circumstances would not identify as black, but in current America, right, identify as black because of the advantages. So what type of Republican loathes Trump? What type of conservative loathes Donald Trump? All right, those who are more classically liberal than conservative, right? Those who love restraint, decorum, institutional legitimacy, right? The rule of law. They fear the strongman impulse. It threatens procedural order, right? Those who are obsessed with limiting power, not embodying power, they hate Donald Trump, right? Trump represents the opposite instinct. Donald Trump loves power, he loves exercising power, he loves the theater of power, he loves asserting himself, he loves following his impulses. He wants to dominate. And for Republicans and conservatives who feel that their tribe has been playing way too nicely, playing by outdated genteel rules while progressives are using power ruthlessly, right? Trump is a breath of fresh air. So Trump hating conservatives tend to be classical liberals, Burkeans, right? People uneasy with raw power, but that means people uneasy with reality, right? Because reality is we naturally orient towards power. And one thing I find quite frustrating is it's really hard to have a descriptive conversation anymore. So 90% of my friends with a graduate level of education hate Donald Trump. And Donald Trump inevitably comes up in our conversations. When it does, I always try to steer things in a descriptive, not a normative direction, right? Description, you're just describing reality. You're not saying whether it's good or bad. So I'll make a remark. Donald Trump is the most risk-taking of any politician that I can remember, right? And I'm just describing something. I'm not saying something good or bad about Trump. And not one then immediately can help themselves from going in a normative direction. And I hate Trump, right? This is why his tariffs are stupid. Did you hear what Warren Buffett said about Donald Trump's tariff plan? Do you know what taco means? Trump always chickens out, right? I mean, I'm far more up on the news than pretty much anyone I know. But they always think that there's some new angle, there's some new strategy that's finally going to contain Trump. Why can't we talk just descriptively, right? Why does everything immediately have to come down to your particular hero system, which we obviously don't share hero systems, so it's pointless to argue about norms when we don't share a hero system. So never Trump conservatives are all about power should be restrained, limited, lawful, morally bounded, procedural, right? Pro-Trump people, power should be used to protect the nation and to punish threats to the nation. Right? These people acting queasy about power, it's a status game. It's BS because it's obviously not evolutionarily adaptive. Dennis Prague would talk about, I don't want power, I just want influence, right? Nonsense. Right? He relished his power, right? But trying to signal that you're refined, that you've got a keen conscience, that you're all about restraint, right? It's a status play. You're showing that in your particular high status group, right, you're vying for more status by denying obvious evolutionary drives. So elites, right, they rarely renounce power. They just reframe it, right? Stewardship, leadership. We're defending norms. It's public service, right? They love to wield authority. They love power. They want to pretend that they don't want to dominate, right? They're taking on claims of noblesse oblige, right? They're just ruling while pretending not to rule, right? They've got a moral purity, right? They're not going to show you their strength and their power. So it's a status camouflage, right? They're showing that they're so civilized that they can be trusted with power because they are highly reluctant to use it. Dennis Prague would say he wants politicians who don't want to wield power.
A lot about my mom throughout the divorce. I learned that my mom speaks to me almost exclusively in quotes from the home goods decor around her house. Like I was down there in Florida and I was crying and crying and
So she's touching on something important here in that I almost never learn anything from conversation because in conversation, people pretty much just say what they're expected to say. And that's boring.
Crying because I just found out I wasn't going to get child support. We don't have kids, but I wanted child support. I wanted inner child support. And my mom was like, Sierra, don't sweat the small stuff. And guess what? It's all small stuff. And I was like, Mom, that's the sign above the couch. Did you just read that to me? My mom is Kaiser Soze. She's just reading home goods decor around.
But pretty much everyone is like that. It's so rare to get a conversation where you truly learn something. So in elite circles such as the academy, power is exercised through credentials, through peer review, through gatekeeping. And that's all masked and disguised and repackaged as it's just about merit. This is just about expertise. It's just about excellence. So you don't have professors and university administrators rejoicing openly in their naked wielding of power. Instead, they're advocating, they're facilitating, they're curating, they're being stewards, right? They accumulate prestige among their peer group from that they are above these normal natural impulses to want power, right? Even as they get to decide who gets tenure, who gets funding, right? So they get to look pure by saying how queasy they are about exercising power. And in the news media, journalists love to tell us that they want to hold power to account. They're not here to wield power. But they set narrative frames, they set agendas, they exercise highly selective outrage. These are all expressions or bids for power. And then they act all uncomfortable when they are the focus, when their amount of power and influence is recognized, because they want to pose as just seeking the truth, not as manipulators, right? Saying, we just report the facts, right? That is the news media's genteel mask for its role as a cultural arbiter. Then we have politicians and bureaucrats who say, I'm just here to serve the people, not I control outcomes. So in this liberal, democratic, left-wing culture, power is something to be performed as a public service. And those who act eager for it look vulgar, and only those who look reluctant, right, they seem trustworthy. Right? This is just BS. Anything that's not adaptive is BS and a status game. Right? So those who tell you they just want influence, not power, they're lying. It's a rhetorical move to appear noble and pure while still pursuing power. Influence is power. It just sounds better. Right? So Dennis Prager's line, he just wants influence, not power, it's meant to reassure listeners that he's not a cult leader. He's not trying to be his guru. His motives are pure and moral. They're not self-interested. But shaping public opinion is a power. And then what about anti-Zionist Jews, right? They don't want Jewish nationalism. They don't want a Jewish state because they think that the religious, the godly path in life is to renounce this worldly power. Well, groups that renounce this worldly power, right, you would think that they'd be at an evolutionary disadvantage. And yet the world's such a complicated place that sometimes a tactic that seems like such an obvious evolutionary disadvantage can work out for people. So if you can position your group as not a threat to other groups, right, that is a powerful evolutionary strategy. So it's entirely possible that in some circumstances, for some groups, right, renouncing this worldly power may be a more effective evolutionary tactic.
Around the house to give me advice. I called her this morning and I said, Mom, I don't know if I'm ever going to get married again. And she said, Sierra, you need to dance like no one is watching. And I said, Mom, are you in the guest bathroom right now? She was. So, I love my mom, though. Love her. I don't like saying I'm divorced because I feel like a used car salesman. I just don't think it's sexy. I feel like I'm like saying like, can I interest you in a 77 Cooper? Let me tell you about our certified pre-owned pussy.
So niche construction, such a powerful idea. Every living thing wants to reconstruct its niche so it's more advantageous for them. Right, this is moral realism. This is a traditional perspective on life. Now, liberal idealism, buffered, enlightened, modern, secular, autonomous, strategic, educated identity, right, treats moral progress as something that just naturally emerges when you give people room to autonomously, strategically reason their way to cooperation. That there is this great value in dialogue, that human beings can transcend their animal drives and the way that power brutally works. But once you recognize the power of evolution, then you notice how so much of this rhetoric is just BS. Everything in life tends towards chaos. Everything in life tends towards entropy, except for one thing: evolution through natural selection. Right? That's the powerful force opposing chaos. Or, if you don't want to think in those evolutionary terms, right, commitment to something higher than yourself, right? That's the one force that can impede the onrushing flood of chaos. Right? To have any kind of order, you have to have power, hierarchy, and the ability to punish. So once you accept power as natural, power is inevitable, hierarchy, discrimination, or natural, and used appropriately, they are healthy, right? Then you don't moralize against power. You're not squeamish against power. You don't try to deny that power is essential. It's just part of a working moral order. So this liberal fantasy of power-free virtue and problematizing power is just intellectual masturbation. Right? There's no permanent control. Right? Life is continually spiraling towards chaos, and only evolution through natural selection or commitment to something higher than yourself. These are the only two forces in the universe that limit the onrushing dominance of chaos. So fleeing power usually will not work for you. It's a survival error. Right? In any social and biological system, abdicating power means surrendering the ability to set the conditions of your existence. Other people will fill that vacuum, and then you'll end up living in a niche shaped by other people's interests, which will not be identical to your interests. Right? If you avoid power, you will stop influencing outcomes, you will lose respect, you will become dependent. Nature does not honor this type of purity. It doesn't honor this type of innocence. It honors fitness. Power is how life asserts form against entropy. Pride and power go together. They both feel amazing, and they're both linked to that feeling of agency, that you can make something happen in the world, right? That you can shape your environment. Doesn't mean you control, dominate it, but you can contribute, right? And that surge of strength feels good because it's adaptive. It reinforces healthy behaviors that enhance the survival of not just you, but your offspring, your people, your group, and your status.
Still got that new pussy smell. It's hardly been used, actually. The last driver was asleep at the wheel. She takes regular lube, nothing fancy. She does have a gray hair growing between her headlamps, but we will take care of that before you take her on a test drive, so take her off the lot.
So all politics is about power, right? The world runs on power and hierarchy, right? Everything else is BS. Right, the left pretends it's about compassion, the right pretends it's all about tradition and order, the center pretends it's about reason. But underneath, everyone's chasing status, power, security, control. Right? Liberals want to disguise their bid for power as empathy and stewardship. Conservatives disguise it as virtue or tradition. Libertarians disguise it as freedom. It's all the same instinct that just expresses itself through different moral costumes. So Americans' discomfort with power comes from America's Protestant moral inheritance, where there is a great emphasis in showing that you've been saved or that you're a good person, that your heart's in the right place. So in Judaism, the emphasis is on the deed. In Protestantism, the emphasis is on the creed. So from a Protestant influence perspective, your bid for power must look reluctant and morally cleansed. So I just love movies where the protagonist doesn't want power. Think of The Patriot with Mel Gibson, and just a ton of movies like that where you got a bloke who just wants to be with his family. I mean, there are a bunch of Mel Gibson movies like this. And Mel just wants to be with his family, just wants to be with those he loves. But it's only the evil of corrupt people in power that drives him to take action and then kill a bunch of bad people. It's a great narrative. I love that story. I think I've loved every single underdog sports film that I've seen. And it can be very appealing to talk about you're just serving the people, you're just protecting democracy or protecting norms, right? You had the prominent judge who just resigned because he's so distressed by Trump's norm-busting threat to democracy. Gladiator, right? The protagonist in the Russell Crowe movie Gladiator, he doesn't want power, right? He just wants to serve the people. So if you want to be a grown-up, you recognize power isn't evil. Power isn't inherently holy. It's simply how life works. And you can exercise it consciously, competently, or you can lie about it. So there are three main styles that academics use to talk about power. You've got the liberal proceduralists like John Rawls and Jürgen Habermas, and they treat power as a problem. They problematize power. It must be contained by their notions of fairness, discourse, and ideal speech situations. Right? They want to moralize restraint, and they want to imagine a politics without conflict where the political is simply run and dominated by disinterested experts. Right? This is a fantasy world, but this is the world of almost every single elite theorist about democracy. This is the world they live in. Then you got the critical theorists and the post-structuralists like Michel Foucault, Bourdieu, Butler, Judith Butler. They want to talk about the hidden structures of white domination. but they don't want to admit they want to replace those structures with their own structures. So their language of deconstruction and resistance is just their way of seeking power in a particular academic dialect. Then you got my favorites, right? The classics, Machiavelli, Max Weber, Friedrich Nietzsche, Carl Schmitt, Hans Morgenthau, talking truth, right? Politics is contest. Politics should not be therapy. Everybody craves power, honor, status, control. And these realists are quite uncomfortable to the modern academic mind, which wants more moral safety. So most contemporary academic theorizing about power is nonsense, right? It's people lying and hiding their will to power behind a facade of moral and analytic neutrality. And those few people who tell the truth, right, they are treated as dangerous. So you want to cut through the moral fog, start with Thucydides, go to Machiavelli, Nietzsche, Max Weber, Carl Schmitt, James Burnham. Now, why do academics love Carl Schmitt so much? Because he gives them permission to go to the dark side, right? They get to slip behind the liberal veil and acknowledge reality, acknowledge that politics is built on exclusion, hierarchy, dominance, war, conflict, and they can do it without renouncing their own civility, right? Carl Schmitt's central claim is the leader, the sovereign, is he who decides on the state of exception. And in a state of exception, everything that was taken for granted is now up for contestation. So we saw during COVID that all sorts of rights to gather and to travel were just immediately taken away because there are not inherent human rights. There are only constructions in a particular civilization which depends on discrimination, hierarchy, keeping certain people out.
I work for myself, so I am a she-EO. I am a vaginapreneur. I'm a fempreneur. And I had an assistant. Well, I had an assistant. I couldn't afford to pay her, though. But I believe in manifestation. Do you all know about manifestation? Do you know how it works? You're just supposed to have the feeling of the thing that you want, and then you will attract it into your life.
Yeah, it was Ozzy Sheila who gave us The Secret. And first time I heard about The Secret was from a friend of mine who made his living 20 years ago. He was a valuable source for me. And now I want to distance myself. I want to take back that he was a friend of mine, but he was a friend of mine. And then he decided to stop talking to me because I was a Trump supporter. But we were friendly. I guess we had an alignment of interest for a while. I needed information, and he was immersed. And he made his living finding out about celebrity sex tapes and then working through lawyers to get celebrities to pay good money so that these sex tapes wouldn't go public, right? He became a sex tape broker, and he did it through lawyers, so it wasn't blackmail. Now, he told me that he believed in The Secret, and he said that The Secret was helping him nail just incredible porn stars. I think Keisha was one of them, one of the Vivid girls. And he was a very homely looking bloke from Cleveland. But The Secret helped him get incredible amounts of transgressive sex. So academics love Carl Schmitt for the intellectual thrill, right? Schmitt is brilliant. He's a radical. He's dangerous. He's like Nietzsche for political scientists. And just reading him feels transgressive. When they talk about Carl Schmitt, they get moral cover, right? They get to quote him to sound daring, but they get to keep their own hands clean, right? We must grapple with Schmitt. That's a way to flirt with realism without owning it. It's like me talking about my struggle, what's Mein Kampf, or the work of Kevin McDonald by comparing it to Torah, compare and contrast. All right, you get to flirt with the transgressive without owning it. They get clarity about violence, right? Carl Schmitt says openly what others only imply, that all law rests on violence, force. All politics depends on the ability to inflict violence, right? And it's intoxicating for people who are trained to pretend otherwise to go into this forbidden territory. So Carl Schmitt lets academics visit the dark side of politics safely, right? They get to analyze the anatomy of power without admitting that they enjoy it. Now, when you're young, from your teens into your 20s, maybe into your 30s, you will naturally orient towards as much power as possible. Then once you start getting into your 40s, you will start preferring comfort over power. So early life is all about expansion. You've got energy, you love competition, you want to mate, you want to prove your capability, you want to establish your path and your family in life. So biologically, psychologically, socially, the youth are wired for power, to establish dominance, to move up in the hierarchy, to secure a territory, to start a family, and to test limits, right? The body and the brain want to grow and want to conquer, right? Then by middle age, our instincts shift, right? The hormones fade, the reward circuits reorient towards comfort, safety, security, and preserving what they built. People swap their drive for power and control for routine and protection, right? They're more about protecting their status rather than chasing it. So young males fight for rank, older ones manage alliances, young empires expand, mature ones bureaucratize, aggression is costly, and comfort feels increasingly like security after years of striving. So what are the biggest lies people commonly tell to claim that they do not want power? I just want to help people. I care about justice. I only want influence. I hate politics. I'm just trying to make things fair. I'm above all that. I'm only doing this out of duty. It's not about me. I don't want leadership. I was just chosen. Power corrupts, so I avoid it. Right? These are all social strategies. These are all status plays. These are ways to wield power while trying to maintain the moral optics of purity. Right? And in Protestant cultures in particular that equate goodness with humility and self-effacement, right? This is how people dominate politely. And think about rabbis. They don't engage in gossip. They just need to know what's going on in their community. Right? It is a performance. Right? They will talk gossip as much as any other group, but they will frame it as community awareness. That way they get to keep the moral high ground. It's just power dressed as duty. Right? I need to know what's going on in my community. Is really saying I need to manage the moral ecosystem. Right? They need information control. That's the foundation of leadership. So religious authority depends on appearing selfish while exercising deep social intelligence. You need to know who's fighting, who's cheating, who's falling apart. That gives the rabbi leverage to guide, mediate, discipline. Right? That's pastoral power in action, and wrapped up in the language of care and God. So the line between information, gossip, and governance is blurry. Right? The moral costume, the concern, the pastoral duty, the community harmony. Right? This turns ordinary social surveillance into a call of duty, call of sacred. So clergy and political leaders run the same play. They want to control information. They want to call their power service, and they want to keep their halo polished. So what are the subtle signs that somebody wields great power?
So I found this checkbook from this account that didn't exist anymore, and I wrote her a check for $1 million, and I gave it to her, and she was so overwhelmed. She was like, oh my God. She was crying. She was like, this is gonna change my life. And I was like, see, this is how it will feel when I can pay you. And then she manifested a new job, so I don't have an assistant anymore. I am looking to hire a white guy because of diversity, and I want to hire like a Mike, or like a Dave, or like a Chris. Is there a Mike or a Dave?
So one sign of a power is that the person is less needy. All right, they are less likely to smile and to try to fawn. Right, you spot the real power often by what doesn't happen. Right, silence draws attention when people speak little, but everyone waits for their reaction. That's power. People who are deferred to without formal authority. If people self-edit around you, you've got power. People want your approval. If people check with you before acting, you've got power. People set the emotional tone. If they are calm, everyone else relaxes. If they are tense, the room tightens. They can say no without explanation. Real authority doesn't justify. They control access. Other people compete for a moment of their time, not vice versa. They operate through proxies. Influence flows from their ideas or preferences even when they're absent. They don't get blamed when things go wrong. Other people take the hit. They shape language. Their phrasing becomes the accepted vocabulary, and other people adopt it. They're unhurried. Time bends towards them. Meetings start when they arrive, not the other way around. They make others feel seen. Their selective attention is intoxicating. People interpret it as validation and loyalty, and it deepens their dependence. Real power isn't loud. Real power isn't needy. Real power means control over narrative, tempo, and emotion. Right? It's the ability to partners, not like conquerors. They cultivate conditions quietly until others depend on them. The cues are understated but deliberate. They make themselves indispensable. They solve problems no one else wants to touch, especially those involving coordination or discretion. They build quiet leverage. They control information flow. They know more than they say. They share just enough to appear transparent. Everyone ends up relying on their narrative. They invest laterally instead of chasing bosses. They build networks sideways and down. They create alliances that outlast any single superior. They grant favors strategically, right? Everyone becomes indebted to them, and it doesn't appear transactional. They're emotionally steady. They are calm. That signals competence and authority. Volatility reveals dependence. They frame outcomes. They define what success looks like. They steer people towards their preferred metrics. They withhold their opinion. They let others talk first. They come in last, so their position is the consensus. They train successors who are loyal. They build an ecosystem that sustains their influence without dominance. They avoid unnecessary exposure, public fights, waste capital. They settle feuds quickly, quietly in corridors and through private messages. They practice moral theater sparingly. When they finally express outrage or anger or conviction, it carries weight because it's so rare. Power accumulates by managing dependency. Capable, never declare control. They make others feel free while quietly shaping what freedom means. And there are some great movies on this type of narrative when people just come out of nowhere to seize power. So All About Eve, 1950, you got an innocent newcomer who insinuates herself into a star's life, learns the ropes, and quietly supplants her. Here's the archetype. You've got charm, observation, patience, and a will of steel. You've got The Godfather, where Michael Corleone is the outsider who methodically consolidates power, eclipses everyone. Talented Mr. Ripley, he's a nobody, but he imitates, he manipulates, and he replaces his social betters through his pure psychological cunning. House of Cards, ambition masters loyalty, the long game of manipulation from the shadows. You got Scarface, where a raw immigrant drive turns ruthlessness into empire. Social Network, where Mark Zuckerberg outmaneuvers friends, rivals, institutions, social norms to seize control of a platform that shapes the modern world. There Will Be Blood, where the protagonist moves from prospector to oil baron through his obsession and calculated cruelty. You've got The Devil Wears Prada, a female version of the will to power. You've got ambition cloaked in fashion, mentorship, and moral compromise. Nightcrawler, you've got a sociopath who builds media power through manipulation, fear, spectacle. You've got Mean Girls, social Darwinism in miniature. Power is information control and charisma management. Whiplash, you've got artistic dominance and submission, the student who matches and internalizes his tyrant's hunger. So power here is not taken by brute force. It's earned through the discipline of watching, waiting, and exploiting openings when others get comfortable. And here's a movie that made me very uncomfortable, but has stayed with me. Saltburn, 2023. It's All About Eve crossed with The Talented Mr. Ripley and a large dose of British class resentment. So the protagonist comes from nothing. He insinuates himself into an elite world. Then he methodically consumes it from inside. So this is envy, not so much envy for money or sex, it's envy of wanting to belong. So the protagonist studies his targets until he can mimic their tone, their posture, and confidence. And once he's inside, he dismantles them piece by piece. Right? He uses his charm, their pity, their need, all as his tools for conquest. Doesn't storm the castle, he gets invited in. Right? That's the modern route to power. Emotional infiltration, not open challenge. And the modern British elite, they now hunger to feel inclusive, and so they are often blind to how someone's admiration quickly turns predatory. Right? People who think they're above power games will end up as trophies in somebody else's power game.
For Chris here. Oh, here we go. Dave. Dave, are you interested in a job? Oh, you are? Wow. What? Tell me about yourself. Lovely kiss. And after I got home, I sent him a text. Confused by it. I went on a date with this guy, Australian guy, and we had this lovely kiss. And after I got home, I sent him a text that said, "You have the sexiest lips." Dave, how would you respond to that text message? Because this is part of your interview. Not as sexy as yours. Not as sexy as yours. Not as sexy as yours.
So how do you pursue power responsibly? Because any instinct, even if it's normal, natural, and healthy, at a certain level of indulgence becomes maladaptive, right? So we all have an appetite for power. It's not a flaw, it's energy, and you can direct it masterfully. You can build mastery, creation, leadership instead of domination, right? You can ground your will for power in competence, right? The more skill, the more knowledge, the more you contribute, right? The more you build, right? The more legitimate your power feels. So this is not manipulation, this is earned power. You can exercise it through building, through creation. Making things that work is a healthy form of the will to power. You can channel it into responsibility. You can volunteer. You can be transparent about your motives. You can develop self-command. You can practice your restraint. You can abstain from flaunting your dominance. You can be calm, clear, decisive. The more understated, the more respect. You can measure your success by how much you help other people, not by how much you can dominate them. You can keep your feedback loops open and encourage dissent. You can link to a higher purpose. So whenever I read a novel or watch a TV show or a movie, when people are undone, it's usually because they pursue their own desires without any restraint of something higher than their own desires. Right? If people just make their number one priority indulging their own desires, that doesn't tend to end well. So the classical liberal project, such as the creation of the United States of America, is built on a noble fear of unchecked monarchical power, and that this is tyranny. So the classical liberal project dispersed authority through constitutions, through markets, through norms. And there are many advantages to that. I'm glad that I live in a classically liberal society. But this project was built on a fiction, and many fictions are useful, but they're still fictions. So you can prize legitimacy over effectiveness, and that's when you're taking your liberalism too far, right? When you can't admit that governance requires coercion, when you can't admit that everybody wants power and to dominate, and that human nature has these powerful, instinctive, cruel, vindictive, hierarchical, evolutionary instincts, and instead think that just institutions will automatically tame them by educating people, you are living in a fiction. So Donald Trump, he is the most emotionally naked president that I remember. So polite, elite, enlightened, buffered society thinks that legitimacy comes from process, following the rules, proceeding on the basis of votes, of norms, of credentials, of civility. Right? Trump recognizes power comes in large part from energy. And where do you get energy? From getting on the same page with other people and then building on that together. So dominance displays confidence, repetition, and Trump has a canny instinct for where fear and admiration live in people. He's really good at reading people. Doesn't seem to read a lot of books, but he seems to be really good at reading people. So Trump recognizes attention is power. By commanding the spotlight, he controls the frame. By generating outrage, mockery, spectacle, these are Trump's currency. So polite elites think that attention seeking is vulgar. Trump treats it as oxygen. Trump recognizes that strength beats consistency. Politicians often fear being called hypocrites. Trump knows that people will forgive inconsistency and hypocrisy if they sense that he is on their side and is exercising his power on their behalf. Fear and loyalty are twins. Right? He intuits those who will be followers, those who are easy to intimidate. He recognizes that rules are tools, that are not always divine absolutes. Elite, polite society worships procedure. Right? Trump sees procedures and rules as instruments that you can negotiate. You can use them when they serve you. You can defy them when they don't serve you. Trump recognizes that shame is leverage. Most polite people fear disgrace. Donald Trump does not. His shamelessness gives him unique freedom. Right? I have done so many crazy, shameful things in my life, and it's out there. Everyone knows about these crazy things. It then gives me certain shamelessness and freedom to say things that people with more to protect would not say. Trump recognizes that identity beats reasoned argument. Right? Trump recognizes politics isn't a debate club. It's a tribal loyalty contest. People join sides that make them feel strong. We're not driven by objective, transcendent, universal moral principles. Trump recognizes the power of chaos. Right? The system craves predictability. Trump, more than any politician I know, thrives in volatility, and so his opponents keep reacting to him. Polite society hides its power behind manners and institutions. Trump strips the varnish off. He plays the game naked.
I've been doing this joke for months. That's the best answer. That's the best answer. Go Dave. What?
You're thinking, what does Heather McDonald have to say about the news. Here she is in an interview November 9th.
Objective test of merit in the area of politics. I would argue that where we're tearing it down that's most worrisome is in things like medicine and science, where we're substituting clear standards of knowledge and achievement for race politics. We are devaluing accomplishment in white and Asian males in order to promote less qualified Black and Hispanic candidates that don't have the skills for highly demanding jobs. So that I'm confident about, saying we are losing merit. In the political realm, it's just very hard to say.
I am less concerned about an affirmative action politician than an affirmative action doctor. Right? I don't want a doctor who became a doctor through affirmative action. I don't want affirmative action architects. Right? I don't want affirmative action air traffic controllers. I'm fine with affirmative action poets.
I mean, you can almost argue that winning is a proof of merit. You have passed some democratic test. So that having been said, putting in my relativist point of view and acknowledgments, what I would say about Mondami is that it shows the triumph of the Columbia University undergraduate mindset, that he spouts these bromides that are beloved of adolescents everywhere, who think they're the first people in history to have encountered alleged injustice. People before profits and housing for all, free buses, tax the rich. These are slogans that do not hold up to reality, and yet, because we have done such an abysmal job of educating young people, they resonate on a very widespread basis. And I'm a pessimist by nature, but I feel like at this point, I really am justified in feeling like this is not a good augury for America's political future.
Can I just push back a little, just in defense of Trump? Sorry, but he did run a business, several businesses. Whether
Lots
you
of bankruptcies.
Whether you think he did it well,
but
I think it's. But I mean, to say that there was something there. In other words, I think this generation has redefined merit. To be, not I've solved problems or tried to. Just that I point them out.
Yes. That's a good argument, and I absolutely believe in the value of having people that have participated in the market. That's what's so utterly infuriating about Mondami and his followers. They have no clue the incredible complexity of market relations and building up an economy this prosperous. So yes, you're absolutely right. I have to say, not being from New York, I frankly forget that about Trump, and I didn't ever watch The Apprentice. So he kind of came into my world belatedly.
Let me ask you, you mentioned Columbia University undergraduate as well as education. You know, looking through some of the data after the election, I mean, some things jump out. One is that Cuomo won among the very highest earners, but also among the very lowest earners. Mamdani basically cleaned up in the middle. The other statistic I saw that just blew my mind was among, I think, women 18 to 30 or 35, Mamdani won over 80% of that demographic. 80%.
81 to be exact.
Yeah, you saw that number too. So what's going on here? In terms of the electorate, in terms of how he put together this.
These questions are so awful. They're so ponderous. They're so lengthy. For an interview, generally speaking, you want your questions as short as possible. These just go on and on. Heather McDonald once told me a story about a writer from some right-wing publication called her for an interview, and then for the next 30 minutes, he went on and on about his own ideas, and then he finally said, "Oh, I need to ask you a question." She said, "I'm sorry, I got to run." So, damn, I'm sorry that I let those ponderous questions go on and on. So, my favorite modern thinker about power is Carl Schmitt, and I asked ChatGPT for the 10 best Carl Schmitt quotes about power, sovereignty, political reality, drawn from his books Political Theology, The Concept of the Political, Legality and Legitimacy, and other works. So here is his most famous statement. Sovereign is he who decides on the state of exception, right? That comes from his 1922 1922 book, Political Theology, right? Power is the capacity to act when the rules break down. There's another line from that book. All significant concepts of the modern theory of the state are secularized theological concepts, right? Power, like divine authority, comes from above. Then, from his 1932 book, The Concept of the Political, the specific political distinction to which political actions and motives can be reduced is that between friend and enemy. So politics, as Carl Schmitt is describing it here, is not politics as we experience it. This is when the political becomes a matter of life and death, and the enemy is he who threatens your life. So politics begins where moral ambiguity ends. Here's another line from that book. The political enemy need not be morally evil or aesthetically ugly. He is simply the other, the stranger, who threatens your existence. So power defines itself by the situation, by exclusion. It is not related or correlated with moral superiority. Every actual political power serves, consciously or unconsciously, some order. Right? Power will always claim to uphold a particular hierarchy, particular morality, a particular social order, even when it's just naked self-interest. The essence of the state is the monopoly to decide. That ability to make decisions is the real core of sovereignty. And then this is the quote that blew my mind last night. There exists no norm, right? Meaning there exists no morality that is applicable to chaos. Morality will not tame chaos, right? When order breaks down, when you're living in the middle of riots, right? Only force can recreate order. There was a Christian preacher who went out to a site of looting, shopping center looting during the LA riots, and he held up a sign, "Do not steal," and he got murdered by a thug. Right? Preachers holding up signs, "Do not steal," will not tend to be terribly successful against the forces of chaos and anarchy and looting as compared to the force of police and bullets. Liberalism loses against the political will of those who know what they want. To remove the political means to deny the possibility of the enemy. If you won't admit what the conflict is, right, you're checking out from reality. In the political, there are no norms, meaning there's no morality, there are only situations. Law follows power, not the other way around. So from the Schmittian perspective, power is not secured by procedures or ideals. It rests on someone's capacity to decide, to exclude, and to enforce, and to wield violence.
Coalition. In a way, I didn't think he could do it.
It's like the Luigi Mangione cult as well. Mm-hmm. For the female in particular, that is very attractive. Now, he has a huge, also the South Asian base, but with regards to the females, I think that's an incredible, it confirms everything I think about the feminization of our culture. Mm-hmm. I went to Columbia University. I'd just gotten back from a trip on the day that the idiot protesters stormed the administration building, which led the then president to call in the police, and this got things even more heated there and insane. I watched for 3 hours these female zombies march around the quad underneath Butler Library, which is adorned, the frieze, with the names of Homer and Aeschylus and Virgil, the great thinkers of the Western tradition, acting like robots.
And the chat says that in the workplace, the sovereign is he who takes the notes. Well, that means AI. AI increasingly takes the notes. Sovereign is he who calls the meeting. Sovereign is he who wastes the time of 20 co-workers. So I do think that millions of jobs will be lost to AI, and millions of jobs will be created by AI. And I am on the side of the techno-optimist. I think there will be an explosion of productivity, the likes of which we have never seen with its rapidity. That there will be hundreds of jobs that will be viable jobs on a Monday, but by the Friday of that same week will no longer be economically viable. But then there will be other jobs that spring up. AI will never have judgment. So you'll need people exercising verification and oversight of AI. And I understand why employers are increasingly getting rid of employees who do not want to embrace AI. So this quote really shook me up last night. There exists no norm that is applicable to chaos, right? You can't preach your way out of chaos. You can't moralize your way out of chaos. You can't rely on rules and rights and procedures to restore chaos, right? Once the structure that holds up rules, rights, and procedures collapses, right, appeals to procedures and rules become empty talk. Only decisive exercise of violence can reestablish the framework, the law, the procedures, right? So Carl Schmitt knew the chaos of the Weimar Republic with its hyperinflation, political assassinations, and humiliation of the Versailles Treaty. The liberal constitution guaranteed rights, but mobs ruled reality. Parliamentary norms were irrelevant when nobody could enforce them, right? No amount of democratic idealism will stabilize a system if you don't have the capacity to exercise violence to impose order. Think about post-invasion Iraq, 2003 to 2006. The U.S. toppled Saddam Hussein, didn't have a plan for maintaining authority, and overnight, the ministries, the police, the courts vanished, and Americans and other Westerners kept invoking democracy, rule of law, human rights, but they had no monopoly on force. Therefore, those words meant nothing. Chaos filled the vacuum. Right? Only when power was re-centralized through the surge and local security deals did anything like norms begin to function again. Think about the financial crisis of 2008. Global banking system seized up. Standard economic rules became irrelevant. Central banks abandoned economic orthodoxy. They had to flood the world with liquidity to prevent collapse. These weren't normal policy moves. Right? These were emergency decisions made by a tiny number of people exercising extraordinary power. Right? Only after you had stability did the language of rules and accountability resume. Think about COVID. You had governors, presidents, prime ministers, bureaucrats invoking all sorts of emergency powers. In every single county in California, and there are more than 50, there is a public health officer who essentially has the ability and the right and the power to shut down any gathering, any business, if it's in the need of the public health. So people with power created, justified, and enforced lockdowns without following normal legal procedures, but they had the power and they had the force and they had the news media and they had elites behind them, and the regular population had to subordinate themselves. Think about Hurricane Katrina. You had politicians declaring states of emergency, imposing curfews, mobilizing the National Guard, but the city was filled with chaos. So norms depend on the ability of the police to inflict violence. Norms, morality, order depend on a judicial system that can punish you, right? Law does not rule by itself, right? Law depends on violence for enforcement. So power, law, police, these are all natural instruments for fighting the chaos that lurks behind every system of order around us. Natural selection is power expressed through feedback and consequence. Everything tends to chaos, except for natural selection and those who live for something higher than themselves. Right? Natural selection, whether it's biological, cultural, political, religious, this is the only force that consistently produces a higher order out of disorder. Everything else drifts towards chaos.
Repeating the same chance. How they could, you're at Columbia to use your mind and you're willing to be robotic for 3 hours. But what struck me, and I wrote about it at the time, was how female the crowd was. Mm-hmm. Now, when it came time in the evening to storm the administration building, they called in the male muscle. But generally,
the heavies.
So good comment in the chat. AI is an interesting tool, but not the best. Well, depends for what, right? There are some situations, there are some challenges for which certain forms of AI are the best tool available. Then there are other situations where the use of AI will be, in all likelihood, a disaster unless you're very careful. So sometimes a telephone, a mobile phone is fantastic, right? Sometimes the internet is the highway to hell. So every tool's depends on its appropriate use. AI is just another tool like the internet or Microsoft Word. So there is no magic key to life, right? There's not one tool that will automatically create the best outcomes.
Pro-Palestinian movement was led by females. And you see that in the universities, the university contempt for free speech now, the belief in this.
Well, isn't Hamas led by females? I mean, Hamas is a very feminist, gay-friendly organization, right?
Pseudo idea of safety and threat and vulnerability, and we need mental wellness, health training all over the place. That's a female instinct. And I would say as well that on average, and again, I'm not talking.
Well, female instincts are good, right? Male instincts breed toxic masculinity. How could we go wrong with allowing female instincts to dominate? So when we have spare time, we ought naturally orient towards those activities that make us feel powerful. Makes me feel powerful to do this live stream, right? We all want to do things that give us a sense of agency, mastery, and control, because normally in a job, you're effectively a slave, not just while you're at work, but you are then constrained outside of work to never say or do anything that could get you fired. And you may very well, and all likelihood do, depend on your job, for example, to pay the bills and to have health insurance. So people work out because it makes them feel physically dominant and they get to make measurable progress. People play video games because they feel a level of achievement and risk and conquest in a safe space. Hobbies and crafts provide command over a small world where the rules make sense and your effort yields results. You can participate in social media and you can get a microburst of status and attention, right? Tiny power jolts through likes and followers. You can participate in politics or social activism and you can feel that your opinions matter. You can learn, and that gives you a feeling of knowledge and ownership, right? This isn't inherently pathological. It's just the nervous system recalibrating. Power is an essential nutrient. It means that we feel that one's actions have consequences. We all have a hero system whereby the small, mundane actions that we take on a regular basis are part of some transcendent, eternal system that give meaning to our life, whether we're pursuing the great value of science or Christianity or Judaism, whatever your particular transcendent hero system is. You can mentor people, you can sponsor people in 12-step program, you can volunteer, and you feel like you're making a difference. So we naturally orient towards doing that, which makes us feel powerful, in large part because so much of daily life removes that feeling of agency.
Talking about anybody's daughter or granddaughter, but on average, the data shows just uncontroversially that not only do males place a much greater premium on free speech, academic freedom, search for truth, females are the ones that are pushing for the speech codes, for the protections. Males are more.
So you would think that the study of power, study of elites would be a major focus of universities, and you would be wrong, right? The modern academy depends on elite patronage and is not comfortable with scrutinizing them. So the modern academy's study of power is timid, it's moralized, and I hate descriptive conversations that become moralized. So universities depend on elite donors, government grants, corporate partnerships. So then directly, critically studying those who fund you is quite awkward. The academy frames politics through particular oppression left-wing narratives where elites are treated as abstract, right? They really don't want to focus on specific people and institutions. Real elite analysis requires structural realism, which is not it's not an easy thing in the modern academy. Professors are part of the elite, right? They're continually competing for prestige, and studying their own class with detachment would mean admitting how status works, how patronage and ideology work inside their very own institutions. That would be dangerous for their well-being. So up to the middle of the 20th century, theorizing about elites was mainstream. After the 1970s, the academy swung towards other studies like post-structuralism and identity frameworks, and talking about elites sounded cruel. Right? Academics prefer moral camouflage. They prefer to critique capitalism or neoliberalism rather than studying reality. rather than studying the real networks of politicians, financiers, and media executives who steer systems. So abstract, timid critique keeps them safe. Now, I'm trad, I'm tribal, I'm nationalist, I'm America first, I like power, I like hierarchy, and I respect the appropriate use of discrimination. From my traditional tribal perspective, discrimination is absolutely essential for individual and communal safety and flourishing. So the more trad you are, the more at ease you should be with power, hierarchy, and the appropriate use of discrimination to protect yourself, your family, and your community. Right? From a trad perspective, power, hierarchy, punishment, exclusion, these are natural facts of life. They're not social pathologies. We recognize that every functioning order and community depends on discrimination. Right? The capacity to discern difference, rank, fitness, threat. Right? Hierarchy means that there's a natural variation in ability, virtue, responsibility. Discrimination means that we can judge wisely, that we can tell who's trustworthy and who's reckless, who's competent and who's pretending, the friend from the foe. Without that, you get entropy. Now, the modern liberal elite, educated, buffered, enlightened sensibility recoils from this because they idealize equality and autonomy and inclusion. These are moral absolutes, and power should be problematized and neutralized, and hierarchy should be flattened, discrimination should be eradicated. Right? From my trad perspective, this is a war with reality. Now, when America had one dominant American hero system, probably up until about 1964, there were many more advantages in standing up for principles within this one dominant hero system. Today, we have a fractured America where people have many different hero systems. So a more ruthless pragmatism is usually a more useful way to go. And standing up for your interests and your people's interests and your family's interests and your tribe's interests and your group's interests, right? That should be a principle to you. Your own interest, your own family, your own community should be a principle for you. It is probably more important than some abstract, global, universal, transcendent moral principle. So when society shares one dominant moral framework, and you still have much of this in Australia, then standing for principle will pay off because more people recognize and reward your sacrifice for this principle. And your social setting will confer the meaning that you've done the right thing. You might lose materially, but you will win symbolically because people agree on what virtue looks like. In America, people don't agree on what virtue looks like. Right? In America now, every tribe has its own canon of heroes and villains. Moral language is a partisan code. Principle has lost market value because there's no universal audience to honor it. What's left is ruthlessness and effectiveness. Right? Ruthless pragmatism is now our dominant currency. So you see this in politics, activism, media, corporate life. People may talk about values when they need to, but they will measure success by control and ruthless pragmatism, because we no longer share a common moral horizon. And standing up for principle sounds like you're saying, hey, I'm a sucker, I'm naive.
Or rational, they're more interested in public affairs, they care more about cost benefit, risk analysis than females. And so an appeal based on an absolute ignorance of market economics doesn't surprise me that it resonates better with females. And
if market economics is so awesome, how come no nation has emerged to economic greatness through primarily operating with free trade and free market economics, right? The way that every single significant power has developed its economy is through government intervention and operating not with free trade, but with a strategic mercantilist trade policy. So there are many benefits to a free trade approach, but it is not a transcendent, overarching, global, universal solution to the need for excellence and safety, right? There are more important considerations than abstract principles of free markets and free trade. So I think it's entirely possible that Zoran Mamdani becomes a good mayor, right? I'd say there's 10% chance he's a good mayor, 20% chance that he's an average mayor.
I think they are going to have increasing clout in our political climate as time goes forward.
Makes you rethink suffrage just a little bit.
Absolutely.
Right?
I'm not just rethinking it. I have rethought
His
it.
whole transition team so far is
women. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, boy.
Yeah.
Well, his
Can I
whole
ask
office
one-
before were women.
Right.
4 women was the extent of his experience
his
as a manager.
His management experience, and
Yeah.
now he's got 300,000 employees.
Right. Let me ask, in a sort of, maybe this is too simple, but how would you divide Mamdani's success?
My God, what a lengthy, awkward question. Come on, man.
Rather than the cause, that's the irony here.
So she's saying government is the solution, right? That's what Mamdani is saying to New York's affordability crisis.
Why is New York not affordable? Why is there not lots of housing? It's because of overregulation, rent control, too much taxes. It's government's doing, and now he wants to solve it with more government, which is completely irrational. But the people that are vulnerable to that pitch, that are that ignorant to think that there's any argument for rent control. I mean, left-wing economists agree. Rent control produces one thing, shortages. Mm-hmm. It does not provide more housing at cheaper rates. Are the same ones with the undergraduate mentality that resonate to anti-Israel, anti-Western slogans and have bought into the entire university worldview that the West is the source of the world's problems and evils, and Israel is, of course, at this point, a Western paragon par excellence. So it's, there may be, but I'm thinking of like the South Asian community that really came out. Obviously, the pro-Palestinian cause is important for them, but so also is affordability.
It felt very concerning to me throughout this campaign that American Jews and New York Jews were constantly talking about his anti-Semitism and his anti-Israel posture when
making the same ridiculous claims about food affordability in New York, which I do not buy. Nevertheless, I am quite sympathetic to...
You can eat really cheaply, right? You can secure enough food on like $3 a day to survive. So I want Trumpcare, and it sounds like the Trump administration is moving, forced by reality, forced by the situation, to start offering some solutions to America's healthcare problems. And I would like a Trumpcare inspired by Vouch nationalism. Right? Vouch nationalism means that there should be all sorts of privileges that are available to you if enough law-abiding adults will vouch for you. And if you can't find law-abiding adults to vouch for you, then there are many privileges that you should not receive, such as owning a gun or driving a car or even walking around in certain high-value areas. So I would like churches and synagogues and groups to be able to offer their own health insurance, and then to offer their own health insurance to their members who agree to abide by certain requirements. So let's shift subsidies from insurers perhaps to individuals. Obamacare was an absolute disaster for me as a freelancer who would secure my own insurance. When Obamacare was instituted, my health care premium went up about 25-30% immediately, and just kept jumping, skyrocketing after that, with higher and higher deductibles. Just absolute disaster for my experience. It was a decade-long $2 trillion transfer from America's more productive citizens to America's less productive citizens. So let's reduce mandates. So Obamacare required that every form of health insurance had to be willing to pay out for addiction rehab at $1,500, $2,000 a day. And that just set off an enormous scam. We had all sorts of halfway houses and rehabs just starting up all over Southern California in particular. So it was just a scam. So how about groups going to bat for each other, and let's tap into that older American model of mutual aid, of fraternal societies, and let's allow more welfare and health insurance functions coming from churches, unions, lodges, right? Exempt them from many of the Obamacare mandates, create risk sharing within a particular community that has requirements. Right? So require people to join, or offer privileges for people to join and sacrifice for each other. Right? Each community should be able to vouch for its own, economically, morally, socially. Citizens should not be passive recipients of federal programs. They should join with each other, create associations, build associations, and then look out for each other, look out for each other's well-being under shared standards, right? And the nation can become a federation of accountable, values-based groups, right? This could replace the universal bureaucratic welfare model with voluntary moral federalism, right? Recognizing that different groups have different hero systems, and you can join a group, a system, and earn your spot there, right? Responsibility would devolve downward. Churches, unions, lodges, co-ops could take on health, welfare, and education for their members who adhere to their rules. Membership would mean accountability, to be vouched for financially, morally, right? You must live up to the covenant. You don't just get benefits without doing anything, right? You maintain trust, you share the practices and the norms of your group, and you build real social capital with other people, and you get to discriminate and lower free riding by weeding out those who will not follow the rules. Right? We could have parallel systems. We could have Baptist health plans. We could have Jewish education networks. We could have secular mutual aid guilds. We could have union cooperatives, all under the same legal umbrella. We could have differentiated communal self-governance. And people will get feedback, and people will be strongly incentivized to manage themselves. People will be encouraged to form bonds with others. It will encourage good behavior, service, social responsibility, and one of the benefits of that will be tangible security, right? Freedom and virtue will be reconnected. Vouch nationalism now.
People that were raising an alarm about his anti-Israel stance, because the counter argument is, well, he really doesn't have that much power. The threat to arrest Netanyahu, would he really do that? Beyond that, could he have boycott, I don't know, of Israel or Israeli academic institutions? Nevertheless, we can't predict.
So one thing that was driving my blogging from day one was that I felt stuck in an insoluble problem, my chronic fatigue syndrome. And I just thought, if I can become famous enough, I will increase the odds that someone with a solution will reach me. And that didn't really work out. It was Amazon's search that threw up beef organ capsules that solved my health problems. Another thing that I hoped for was that if I simply become famous enough, people will pay me to fly around the world, and they'll put me up. Because travel without someone paying your way is very expensive. And to earn the money to engage in expensive travel, you have to suit yourself to be of great service to others. And I have been often maladaptively selfish and self-centered, and I wasn't interested in being of so much service that I could then accumulate enough capital to pay for my travel. So I thought, let me just get famous enough and people will fly me around the world and they'll put me up and I won't have to pay. And so it worked out a little bit. I had one fan of my blog who flew me to London for 2 weeks. I had the Canadian version of the BBC, of the BBC, I think it's called the CBC. They paid for me to fly to Montreal for 5 days and put me up in a nice hotel. So I got some of the benefits, but not as many as I would like. And there was a point to that, and I've completely forgotten my point. Oh, yes. So the one time I was in New York City, the one time I got to stay in New York City, which is an expensive place, I met an heiress through a singles ad. And when I was young and charming and handsome, she paid for my flight and she gave me spending money every day. And I stayed with her for 3 weeks on the Upper West Side in August of 1994. And then I almost went back to New York in 2008 because I secured a deal where I was doing research for $70 an hour. And I thought, I need to go to New York to do some research, and my expenses were going to be paid. And just as I was setting up to fly to New York, my wonderful deal came to an end. But consorting gigs, those are really the way to go. So vouch nationalism, right? We vouch for each other so the state doesn't have to. We create a nation of responsible adults, not wards. We develop freedom to associate and responsibility to sustain. Let communities care for each other and for their own. Let's have vouch nationalism replace bureaucratic universalism with incentives for more civic responsibility. Right, let's restore America as a federation of self-governing moral communities, each capable of caring for its members under shared values. Let's emphasize reciprocity over entitlement, pluralism within unity, right? Different moral orders can coexist under one flag. We can have religious, ethnic, civic associations operating parallel communities. And we will have market discipline applied to social care, and citizens will regain the link between virtue and security. It's through public service, sobriety, stability, responsibility, discipline, right, that you will build tangible benefits within your community. Right, vouch nationalism now. Freedom with responsibility. Nation of communities, not clients. We're not just citizens, we're guarantors of each other. We can have moral order without bureaucratic control. Right, replace bureaucratic dependency with civic responsibility. Let's revive the American tradition of voluntary association of churches, lodges, guilds, local cooperatives. Let's dial back the civil rights law. Let's reduce the power of litigation to upset our lives. Let's reduce the incentives to fight with each other. So populism means that wisdom resides with the people. We are one people, and in a populist unified nation, we will no longer have elite rule, because elite rule depends on pluralism. Elite rule depends upon the elite getting to make governing coalitions with this group and that group.
What the consequences of this worldview will be, and it seems to me that it is at least indicative of something which I actually argue in the university context, where I don't think universities are anti-Semitic. I don't. Let's face it, Jews are not being discriminated against qua Jews. They're being discriminated against as whites. So to me, what's really happening on universities is hatred of Western civilization. And so Mamdani, yes, he is focused on his anti-Israelism, may be more concentrated, but it is also part of an entire worldview that I think is going to redound very poorly. But if I were...
So vouch nationalism, right, works on the raw, brutal reality of human nature. It tends to be selfish and self-seeking. Right, so vouch nationalism plugs directly into how we have organized ourselves for tens of thousands of years. Right, we are evolved to be tribal. We evolved in small groups that survived through reciprocal obligation. I hunt for you today, you protect me tomorrow. Right, mutual aid was conditional. Membership came with behavioral expectations. That's the vouch model. That's the tribal model. Right, evolutionary game theory shows cooperation is stable only when cheaters are punished and excluded. A bureaucratic welfare state severs that loop. Vouch nationalism restores it. In ancestral environments, our moral conduct was public, and our moral reputation determined our survival. So virtue signaling was not a meme, it was adaptive. So by tying benefits to communal standing, vouch nationalism reactivates that reputational economy in a structured modern form. Right? You gain security and status by being trustworthy and pro-social within your tribe. Right? People naturally favor people like themselves, their kin. Modern liberal institutions attempt to suppress that bias in favor of abstract universalism and individualism. That is psychologically unnatural. So vouch nationalism channels these voluntary associations that mimic kin structure, tribal structure of shared beliefs, rituals, codes. It's a way to shape and domesticate tribalism rather than pretend that we've transcended the tribe. We are evolved to seek status and hierarchy. With vouch nationalism, we will build status and hierarchy by serving our tribe. So vouch nationalism recreates healthy status competition to gain prestige by contributing to your group. Vouch nationalism restores freedom of association, and it gives groups the ability to punish and exclude free riders. So life will become more fair, and in a fairer world, people will feel more at ease. Vouch nationalism will restore community, meaning, belonging. Right? We are wired to be social. We're not wired to be primarily individuals just working everything out in our own minds. So Vouch nationalism is a strong evolutionary fit. It doesn't fight human nature. It rides human nature. It channels human nature. It builds communities that run with the reality of human nature, and it encourages reciprocity, appropriate moral signaling, selective trust, earned belonging. So our current liberal bureaucratic universalism tries to override these basic instincts, and it produces alienation, cynicism, and parasitic free riding. So Vouch nationalism is the modern adaptation of our oldest social design. We get to build reciprocal moral tribes federated under a common banner. It's Darwin meets de Tocqueville.
Jewish, I would not at all be comfortable today. I think it's
we
very
might disagree
worrisome
on this. I think it was the right stand to make, and obviously it was in a losing cause. But I think also just taking Mamdani at his word. I mean, for him, the Israel issue.
Talking about your solutions to affordability are perverse. They're going to counter.
Already lining up to leave. They've been leaving, but now they're rank and file officers and give it to these community review boards. What's your prediction for the NYPD in terms of recruitment, retention, and what will that look like to the average person in New York?
Well, we're already down 5,000 officers. We need another 5. Policing, the number of police actually.
My greatest fear is chaos and disorder. Ergo, I have a natural bias in favor of the police, because without police and government, men will swallow each other alive.
Does matter. One would like to think, well, that's, it's a facile measure of effectiveness, but no, something called command presence really does make a difference, whether you can just.
And chat says, press 1 if you would vouch for your girlfriend. So there is a craziness among many educated liberal women who, thank God, have never been punched in the face. But because they've never been punched in the face, they speak and act with a recklessness that comes from that naive, sheltered upbringing. And if your woman is not willing to abide by the realistic observations that you share with her, such as it's a really bad idea to start arguing with certain strangers or to venture into certain situations, then I don't think you have a moral obligation to protect her, right? If your highly educated, sheltered woman is getting into dangerous situations and dangerous fights with dangerous people, then you have to step away and remove yourself, because you're very likely to get seriously hurt in that situation, and you can just make yourself ready to call 911 when she reaps the consequences of her reckless arguing.
Position officers in
Right. Protection comes with meeting certain obligations, and getting into dangerous, reckless situations for no good reason is a denial of reality. It's a denial of your common sense observation, and people who do that have forfeited your protection.
Shooting hot spots. Their very presence there deters crime. And it also means that you have more people, more detectives available to work cases. So I think you're absolutely right, Rebecca. It's one civilian complaint review board. There's not several, but these entities generally have been a cause of the left for a very long time, because of the belief, false belief, that police commissioners are rubber stamps on the alleged racism and misconduct of their officers, which I can tell you is not the way police officers see it. It's a very embattled mentality, and it can be a little bit annoying when you're dealing with cops, because they sometimes, they are so hunkered down, they barely even know who the commissioner is. It's quite amazing.
So I was doing some shadow work before the show. I was asking ChatGPT about my shadow. So ChatGPT has gotten to know me, and ChatGPT notes that I appreciate precision with words, that I exercise a certain level of discipline. This creates a shadow self that hates disorder, weakness, and failure. And my shadow is the fear of chaos, being caught off guard, appearing unprepared, being at the mercy of the irrational. So I can make peace with this shadow self by seeing chaos not as a threat, but as a teacher. When something doesn't go to plan, it's an invitation to practice trust, adaptability, and humility. I value truth above comfort, and that creates contempt for self-deception and groupthink. Right? My shadow self here is arrogance disguised as clarity. It's my quiet sense of superiority, that others are trapped in illusions that I've outgrown. And my task is compassion. Everyone is defending themselves from something. So that can soften my edge and reconnect me to the messy people around me. I had a wise therapist who said, maybe you'll only heal if you put down your guns. I care about strength, excellence, and moving upward. And that hides my wounds, my fears of invisibility and inadequacy. So my shadow self wants applause for reassurance that I matter. And I can make peace with this part of my shadow self by letting that part be visible without shame. I don't have to kill my vanity. I just need to be clear and honest about it. I admire Charles Darwin's empirical humility. I despise pretension. But my intellectual humility can become a defense to. It's a way to stay safely analytical when emotion or intimacy threatens to overwhelm me. So this shadow self wants to be felt, not studied, and the cure is embodiment. Right? When I notice myself drifting into abstraction, come back to breath, the body to relationship. Shadow of the judge. I see patterns of guilt and avoidance everywhere. I can make forgiveness hard, especially towards myself. The task is integration, seeing that this shadow self is not criminal. It's just unacknowledged energy. The parts that I condemn, my neediness, my envy, my laziness, my resentment, they're all trying to protect something that's tender. So don't try to fix these shadow selves, invite them in. When my arrogance shows up, say, you're just trying to protect me from humiliation. Thank you. When my fearful shadow self tries to control everything, I can say, I understand you're just trying to keep me safe. Integration means every part gets a voice, but not the steering wheel. So one thing I learned in 12-step that people don't usually make progress against their self-defeating reactions to reality, against their character defects, until they recognize how their character defects have been helping them. So let's say my sponsee has a character defect of isolation. Until he spells out and recognizes all the ways that isolation has served him. It's kept him safe. It's preserved his energy. He's been able to do what he wants and not be controlled by others. He doesn't have to negotiate messy relationships. Until you come to terms with how your character defect or your maladaptive response to life has been serving you, you're not going to make any progress. So first list all the ways that the defect, the maladaptive reaction to reality, has served you. Then move on to all the ways it has hurt you. And then, and only then, move on to all the ways that you would benefit from the opposite of your character defect. So I had a very exciting night by ordering my favorite stuff on Amazon Fresh. And on average, my favorite stuff was more than 10% cheaper. It was like, on average, probably 15 to 20% cheaper. What the heck is going on? I checked with ChatGPT. Amazon Fresh has been quietly cutting grocery prices to compete with Walmart, Costco, and Aldi. And they're dropping prices across key staples. They're not doing flashy coupons. I mean, permanent, significant base price cuts on my favorite items. It's like, wow, this is fantastic. And I love the new Apple earbuds, the expensive ones, the ones that, with live translation, etc. The one with noise cancellation. So much pleasure, so much luxury they give me for, what, a bargain price of $250?
It's a very much an us against them mentality, because nobody really understands what they're up against. I mean, we're the one group, they are the one group that we ask to interact daily with inner city dysfunction and pathologies. They are beyond belief. I mean, Americans that are in their little bubbles have no idea what these inner city households look like. I've been on ride-alongs, and the squalor, the chaos, the abuse is just beyond fathoming.
Yes.
The cops have to see this, and they're not allowed to talk about it. It's psychologically stressful. And if they blow off steam in a text, they're going to be accused of being racist. So they're very hunkered down. But so they often feel like discipline coming from their own police commissioner is based on misunderstanding. But for sure, these civilian complaint review boards tend to be staffed by leftists out of the nonprofit community, and right now their recommendations for discipline are just recommendations to the police commissioner, who can follow or not, which is a check. But if they are the last say, you're absolutely right. At the first major incident, if there's a cop shooting,
which there will be, because they're working in high crime environments, in an environment of lots of drive-by shootings, there will be an exodus. And the question is, the big question hanging over all of this, we have now in New York, finally, a police commissioner, Jessica Tisch, who has received accolades, and she stands for most everything that Mamdani opposes. She is in favor of broken windows policing, public order policing, enforcing the so-called low-level misdemeanors. I hate to even use that dismissive term, because as far as I'm concerned, all crime is serious. But she believes in that. Mamdani doesn't. Nevertheless, Mamdani has said he will ask her to stay on, and my guess is she will accept, because I don't think people walk away from power that easily. But
really, you think she's going to stay?
I do.
Ah, interesting.
There's no better job. If you're in the police world, there's no better job than being head of the NYPD.
But if you're so handcuffed that you can't do the job you want to do, and you got blamed for all the failures, wouldn't that be a bad bet?
She can walk out.
She
can
walk out at that.
She can try. But
okay.
But whether she would accede to having her authority be subordinate to the CCRB is a real question.
Yeah.
So Rebecca got to this a little bit, but
so Ben Shapiro is bravely standing up for his principles against the onrushing tide of moral anarchy unleashed by people like Nick Fuentes and Tucker Carlson.
And there's no doubt that Nick Fuentes has a lot of play these days. That's because the left, by moving into a politics of anti-white, anti-Christian, anti-male identitarianism, created its bizarro mirror image, a white pseudo.
So I agree basically with almost everything that Ben stands for. It's just, I find his analysis so plebeian and low IQ.
Judeo-Christian incel identitarian movement dedicated to destroying the institutions of this country and replacing Americanism with something else. Nick Fuentes' philosophy is not fully formed. It's an incoherent stew of malignity. But that's where Tucker Carlson enters the story. Now, since his exit from Fox News...
So, as opposed to Ben, right, he's not... Ben's not incoherent, right? I'm frequently incoherent. Ben's frequently incoherent. Hey, everybody hurts, bro.
In 2023, when, of course, he was a very, very popular host, Tucker Carlson has turned himself into a conspiracist and a crank and a pathological liar. Tucker excuses Vladimir Putin's murderous and barbarous reign. He has even become one of his most ardent defenders.
It is so much nicer than any city in my country. I had no idea. My father spent a lot of time there in the 80s when he worked for the U.S. government and barely had electricity. And now it is so much cleaner and safer and prettier aesthetically. Its architecture, its food, its service, than any country, city in the United States that you have to, and this is non-ideological. How did that happen? How did that happen? And at a certain point, I don't think the average person cares as much about abstractions as about the concrete reality of his life. And if you can't use your subway, for example, as many people are afraid to in New York City because it's too dangerous, you have to sort of wonder, like, isn't that the ultimate measure of leadership? And that's true, by the way, it's radicalizing for an American to go to Moscow, I didn't know that, I've learned it this week, to Singapore, to Tokyo, to Dubai and Abu Dhabi. Because these cities, no matter how we're told they're run and on what principles they're run, are wonderful places to live.
So I guess...
My God, that is so shocking.
You put in 10 rubles here, and you get it back when you put the cart back. So it's free, but there's an incentive to return it and not just bring it to your homeless encampment. I went from amused to legitimately angry So we were guessing what this would cost. Everybody hears from the United States, buys groceries, and we didn't pay any attention to costs as we were just putting in the cart what we would actually eat over a week. And we all came in around $400, about $400. It was $104 US here. And that's when you start to realize that ideology maybe doesn't matter as much as you thought, corruption. If you take people's standard of living and you tank it through filth and crime and inflation, and they literally can't buy the groceries they want, at that point, maybe it matters less what you say or whether you're a good person or a bad person. You're wrecking people's lives in their country, and that's what our leaders have done to us.
When Tucker Carlson interviewed Vladimir Putin, by the way, Vladimir Putin was so amused by Tucker Carlson's easy questioning that he actually mocked him.
Oh, my. So, Ben says, the issue here isn't Tucker, right? It isn't that Tucker had Nick Fuentes on his show. He has every right to do that. The issue here is that Tucker Carlson decided to normalize and fluff Nick Fuentes, and that the Heritage Foundation then decided to robustly defend that performance. And Ben describes Tucker as the most virulent super spreader of vile ideas in America. Now, I think much of Tucker's analysis is increasingly stupid and low IQ and conspiratorial, but I'm just not interested in these normative moral denunciations. Ben says Tucker takes other people's hideous ideas, he softens them, he treats them with love and care, then he provides them with a massive signal boost. And Ben wants us to know it's not cancellation to draw moral lines between viewpoints. We used to call that one of the key aspects of conservatism. And Ben lets us know he has fought for his principles all his life. And I much prefer the alliance theory of politics. What drives politics is not principle. It is forming alliances so that you can govern. So principles are usually propaganda devices serving to maintain alliances, right? They're not really moral absolutes. So Ben Shapiro's principles of free speech, Western civilization, rational debate, Israel's moral clarity are not unified by abstract logic, right? They function strategically within promotion of a certain alliance network, right? They rally support for his brand, for pro-Israel conservatives, for religious trads, for anti-woke centrists, for big donor institutions, right? His principles are fixed only to the extent that his alliances are stable. When his alliances shift, his moral principles shift accordingly. He defends Elon Musk's free speech absolutism and then stops defending it when Musk platforms voices that threaten Jewish interests or mainstream conservatism. So alliance theory predicts that ideological coherence will very quickly give way to a transitive logic, right? The enemy of my enemy is my friend. So Tucker Carlson and Nick Fuentes both challenge the GOP donor class and the Israel First orthodoxy, so that places them in partial alliance with populists and dissidents who Ben Shapiro disdains, people who are Ben Shapiro's existential rivals, so Ben then denounces them. It's not maybe so much about moral deviation, it's about defending his coalition's transitive chain, pro-Israel donors, legacy conservative media, Ben Shapiro's Daily Wire ecosystem. Nick Fuentes' overt hostility towards Israel, Tucker's flirtation with post-liberal nationalism break that transitivity. So by calling them anti-Semitic and immoral, Ben uses victim and perpetrator biases to cast his faction as the righteous victim, and the Fuentes-Tucker faction, bunch of bad people. So Ben uses moral language to cloak what is an alliance defense. So alliance theory, developed by people like UCLA evolutionary psychologist David Pinsoff, identifies three common distortions that maintain our loyalty networks. Right? We focus on perpetrator bias. We excuse the wrongdoing of our allies. So Ben Shapiro will rationalize anything bad that US and Israel does and anything bad that their militaries do. These are just tragic necessities. And at the same time, he'll condemn identical tactics by enemies of Israel and of the US. He will exaggerate his own side's grievance, right? The more intense your in-group identity, the more intense your sense of grievance and victimhood. He will frame criticism of Israel as evidence of Jewish victimization. He will dismiss right-wing Christian complaints about Israeli censorship or economic marginalization. He will attribute the success of members of his coalition to their virtue and to their enemies' vice. So he builds a narrative that conservative Jews built civilization on merit, while leftists and griftists and populists try to destroy it. So the right has been realigning in America over Israel, over nationalism, over identity. So political alliances have shifted. And Ben Shapiro's pro-Israel neoliberals are now finding themselves opposed by these new alliances, right? The populist America First crowd seeking to overturn the hierarchy of the pro-Israel crowd. And Tucker kind of straddles both crowds. He tries to reconcile populist energy with legacy respectability. So these conflicts arise when a coalition's internal system fails, when your allies start sharing enemies, no longer share interdependence. So Ben Shapiro depends financially and reputationally on the donor class and on an institutional ecosystem that Tucker Carlson and Nick Fuentes now threaten. So Ben's moral outrage may be better understood as an adaptive defense mechanism for the alliance that funds and protects Ben. It's not really about some betrayal of abstract global universalist reason.
Carlson has massaged the Iranian dictatorship and admitted to not asking any difficult questions of the president of that dictatorship.
The interview is limited by a couple of factors. One, it was done by remote through a translator. That's always awkward. For another, I don't speak Persian.
Insulting interviews, tough interviews, asking hard questions, sometimes that's a good thing to do. Sometimes it diminishes the quality of an interview. Situation dependent.
And there are all kinds of questions that I didn't ask the president of Iran, particularly questions to which I knew I could not get an honest answer, such as, was your nuclear program totally disabled by the bombing campaign by the U.S. government a week and a half ago? There's no chance he's going to answer that question honestly. I didn't bother to ask it. The answer, in fact, from an American perspective, even from the CIA's perspective.
So politics masquerades as morality play, but politics functions as coalition maintenance. Right? Ben Shapiro's lifelong principles are consistent only in their service to the same core alliance structure that has defined mainstream conservatism since the Reagan era. Right? Pro-market, pro-Israel, anti-left, culturally traditional, corporate-friendly. Tucker Carlson's populism, Nick Fuentes' ethno-nationalism threaten that structure from below, so moral condemnation becomes strategic warfare. So this fight on the right is not about truth or principles or ethics. It's about which set of strange bedfellows will define the new Republican conservative alliance. So Ben Shapiro's claim of "I fought for certain principles all my life" collapses the minute you apply any sort of historical or alliance theory scrutiny to his principles. Right? Ben poses as this lifelong moral crusader, but there's no adaptive evolutionary incentive to be a lifelong universal moral crusader. Right? What people describe as principles are usually alliance signals that change when coalitional incentives change or someone's playing a status game. Right? I do this show as part of a status game. I think that I have profound things to say, and there's a tiny number of people out there who will appreciate them, and so I want their esteem. So Ben Shapiro's supposed constants, right? His fight for free speech, for truth, for Western values, for moral consistency, these are all stage props for defending whichever allies secure his relevance and his funding. Right? Shapiro moved from never Trump to Trump defender. Right? 2015, 2016, Ben Shapiro was continually denouncing Donald Trump. He's a bully, a liar, a stain on conservatism. Ben framed himself as the principal conservative, standing athwart Trumpian populist vulgarity. Then when Trump captured the conservative base in the Republican Party and his media audience shifted, Ben Shapiro's principles morphed into, we must defeat the left and Trump is our imperfect vessel. So this is a textbook transitivity shift. When your rivals, the media, the left, make an enemy of Trump, loyalty to your coalition requires you to side with Trump. So Ben Shapiro's bias rewrote his moral story. He didn't change, the world did. Trump didn't become moral, he became useful. This isn't moral growth, it is alliance realignment. The never-Trump conservative class loses power. Ben Shapiro adapts to remain inside the dominant coalition of donors, culture warriors, and MAGA media economy. So Ben Shapiro's principles can be understood as performance for his patrons. He's got a media empire, the Daily Wire, that depends on monetizing outrage. Right? We're fighting for you against those perfidious elites who are screwing you over. Right? I am your voice. Right? He wants financial and intellectual cover for his tribal loyalties. His principles are curated to fit the preferences of the donor class, pro-Israel, anti-regulation, anti-woke, and flexible enough to keep his populist subscribers on board. When his sponsors shift, when his allies shift, when the situation shifts, his principled rhetoric shifts. Right? He'll rail against populist nationalism when it threatens Jewish or corporate interests, then pivot to national conservatism when that polls well. He'll champion free speech until someone criticizes Israel. He'll preach personal responsibility until the working class heartland needs subsidies. Right? His moral principles are not so principled. So what Ben Shapiro calls principles are better understood as propagandistic loyalties. Ben will ally with those who share his subcultural identity, religious, Zionists. He will align with whoever fights the left, even if that means siding with Trump or Elon Musk. He relies financially and reputationally on right-wing networks that expect loyalty to Israel and opposition to the left and to populism. When his alliance realigns, his principles mutate. He doesn't betray them, he redefines them so that his coalition remains morally coherent to itself. All right, Ben claims he's fighting for principles. It's a self-serving moral fiction. It's a tactic to frame himself as the victim of betrayal rather than an agent of opportunism. When Ben attacks Fuentes and Tucker, he's not defending principles. He's defending his status. He's defending the legitimacy of his donors. He's defending his alliance's moral hierarchy, pro-Israel, pro-capitalism, and his media empire. When he backs Trump or Musk, he's not embracing hypocrisy. He's recognizing the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So principled figures will use all this moral talk to signal their loyalty, to recruit allies, to justify their double standards. Right? He's not so much a lifelong fighter for principled. He is a disciplined coalition operator whose moral vocabulary will shift as fluidly as his donor base.
Perspective is unknowable.
Tucker bizarrely worships at the altar of Qatar.
They're mad at you because you don't put your parents in some institution. Maybe they're trying to break up your families.
Tucker Carlson praises Venezuela's Nicolas Maduro, even as Maduro keeps the entire country in communist penury and ships fentanyl into the United States to kill Americans by the hundreds of thousands.
Why are we so opposed to Nicolas Maduro? So if you ask someone on the street, random person, why are we against Nicolas Maduro? The answer you're going to get is, who's Nicolas Maduro? But if you find someone in South Florida, for example, who knows who Nicolas Maduro is, who can identify where Venezuela is on a map, that person will almost certainly say, well, because he's a communist or a socialist, he's exceedingly left-wing, and that is true. Nicolas Maduro and his government are very left-wing on economics, not on social policy, by the way, which is kind of interesting. In Venezuela, gay marriage is banned, abortion is banned, sex changes for transgenderism are banned. It's one of the very few countries in the entire hemisphere with those policies.
I didn't realize there was so much sex change surgery in Iran because it's so opposed to homosexuality. So if you're a bloke who wants to have sex with blokes and you want that to be accepted, you have to get surgery or go through some kind of transition to be able to pull that off and become a woman in Iran. So Ben Shapiro's principles can also be understood as a tactic, an evolutionary adaptation to changing power conditions within the American right. And sometimes your enemies will have much more clarity than your friends. And one enemy of the right, who is frequently very sharp, very smart, is Rick Perlstein. And he wrote a great essay in 2012 called The Long Con. He talks about how back in 2007, he signed onto the email list of various influential magazines on the right, Town Hall, Newsmax, Human Events. And he noticed that these right-wing operations would then sell their mailing list to these third-party scammers. And these third-party scammers recognize that anyone who's so dumb as to sign up for these type of mailing lists is going to be a fairly easy mask. So the emails that he would get were amusing. Right? Dear reader, I'm going to tell you something, but you must promise to keep it quiet because the elite will not be happy with me. They know what I'm about to tell you. We have to tread carefully. So most people are paying attention to the stock market and the bank and brokerages and big institutions, right? But they have their real money elsewhere. All you have to know is the insider's code, which I'll tell you, and you can make an extra $6,000 every single month, right? What kind of moron believes this? Type of moron who signs on for a Newsmax or a Town Hall email list. You know about the 23-cent heart miracle? The one that Washington, the medical industry, and the drug companies refuse to tell you about? Why would they tell you? They'd be leaving money on the table. Right? I was scheduled for open heart surgery when I read about your product. Did you know about the oil field in the placenta? Dear Newsmax reader, Please find a special message below from our sponsor, James Davidson, editor of Outside the Box. Here's some important information to share with you. If you have shied away from profiting from the immense promise of stem cells to treat disease because of moral concern over extracting stem cells from fetal tissue, pay close attention. You can now invest with a clear conscience. An Israeli entrepreneur. Who would you trust more than an Israeli entrepreneur? Zami Aberman has discovered an oil field in the placenta. And you can purchase a share in his company for the low price of just 12 cents, right? And your $10,000 outlay could bring you a profit of more than $250,000. Right, so why is it that right-wing media is largely funded by peddlers like this, by those who promote fictional miracle cures and get-rich-quick schemes? Why is much of right-wing media powered by snake oil salesmen? Right, you don't get this so much in the mainstream culture. Right, so you can go to Human Events and read about ideas that will drive conservative revivals. Right. And then you can get headlines: reverse crippling arthritis in 2 days. Clear clogged arteries safely and easily without drugs, without surgery, and without a radical diet. High blood pressure cured in 3 minutes. Right? Did you know about the oil field in the placenta? So there's this massive intersection, essentially, between snake oil salesmen and conservative media. Right? And why did snake oil vendors and conservatives team up? Why do they work together? Why are conservatives so vulnerable to this kind of nonsense?
Policies. It is on social policy, not defending the regime, just saying, one of the most conservative countries in North or South or Central America. Only El Salvador really comes close.
Tucker Carlson glosses Hamas, the genocidal jihadi group behind October 7th, as a political organization.
You can't claim that they're in Hamas while simultaneously claiming that Hamas is,
So Human Events and Ben Shapiro and Fox News, they operate with a business model of moral theater, right? They fuse their ideological evangelism with grift, with oil fields in the placenta, fear-based marketing. Liberal elites are villains. Find your salvation through subscribing or donating. Right, so Ben Shapiro's principles work the same way that Paul Weyrich's fake UN scare letters work. Right, they dramatize existential peril from left-wing elites to mobilize cash and loyalty. Right, they package propaganda for profit. They promote a victim bias. You're being persecuted by woke tyrants. They push perpetrator bias. Our side's excesses are righteous. Right, to build an audience. Right, the Daily Wire is not a forum for moral principles. It is an evolved descendant of the direct mail hustle described in the oil field in the placenta. It's a political outrage industry as a self-funding feedback loop. So when Ben says he's fighting for certain principles all his life, he's performing moralized alliance signaling. The Daily Wire is an institutionalized grift. Right-wing outfits discover that feeding outrage and victimization and fear are the most reliable currency to develop a business model. Right? There's a perpetual crisis pushed by the right-wing media. The left is coming for your kids. There's salvation offered through consumption. Right? Buy these products. Get these subscriptions. Get our right-wing coffee, our right-wing razors. Movies that fight the cultural war. We've got charismatic brokers, and who's more charismatic than Ben Shapiro, translate paranoia into purchases. Right? You got the political con and the money con, all part of the same enterprise. Daily Wire is pushing not news, but identity validation. You get to feel morally clear. You get to signal your loyalty to the remnant. Now, the Nick Fuentes, Tucker Carlson appeal to a different group of losers of globalization is creating a new revolutionary alliance between disaffected nationalists and religious populists. And this move exposes the contradictions between the Daily Wire's moral branding and its dependence on corporate advertisers and Israeli alignment. So we've got a coalitional fracture and a moral panic. So politics masquerades as morality to mobilize its coalition, right? Oil in the placenta shows that conservatism's infrastructure is monetized grift, right? Claiming that you spent your life fighting for principles is a performance of moral theater. Ben is really fighting for the credibility of his grift. He's making a marketing story about his moral conviction. He's trying to monetize outrage.
Group of jihadis, they're Islamic extremists, which they also claim constantly, which I don't know if that's true, by the way. It seems more like a political organization, but whatever it is, they're telling us constantly they're Al-Qaeda.
Tucker Carlson has attacked President Trump as a cover-up artist for sex trafficker Jeffrey Epstein on behalf of Israel and Mossad, making sure, of course, never to mention President Trump's name, because, of course, Tucker's a coward.
And moreover, it's extremely obvious to anyone who watches that this guy had direct connections to a foreign government. Now, no one's allowed to say that that foreign government is Israel because we have been somehow...
Well, if you optimize for truth, it's not necessarily clear that he was connected to some kind of foreign intelligence service. Might be. I don't care either way. I think it's a worthy topic of investigation, but all sorts of things that Tucker preaches are morally clear, not necessarily so clear. So Ben Shapiro and the Daily Wire network, push this oil in the placenta grift, right? It is a fusion of fundraising and fear-mongering. Right? Every woke outrage headline is a hook to sell memberships, merchandise, lifestyle products. The ideological posture of rational debate and Western values is a respectable veneer on a grift, on the 23-cent heart miracle. Alex Jones, right? He is really a peer of Ben Shapiro. He sells supplements and survival gear on the back of his constant fear programming of government plots, pandemics, globalist cabals. He merges ideology and commerce so seamlessly that his politics can't exist without his store. It's the placenta con updated for the age of InfoWars. You got the monetization of paranoia. Glenn Beck, pioneer in the fusion of prophecy, Christianity, patriotism, and product. His gold line, his emergency food sponsorships in the Obama era, right, depict America collapsing and then offering commercial salvation for $19.95 a month. Right, he self-brands as a moral guide and an investment guru. He's a transition figure between televangelist grifters and influencer capitalists. Steve Bannon merges populist revolt with venture capital opportunism. He positions himself as the anti-elite warrior while running data mining and fundraising operations that mirror the elites he denounces. His entire war room brand operates as a perpetual crisis machine, a paranoia machine that converts anger and fear and paranoia into donations and email lists. Right, the same sort of machinery that Richard Viguerie built in the 1970s. Charlie Kirk and Turning Point USA, another direct mail pyramid. Right, endless fundraising appeals tied to lurid warnings about Marxism, grooming, campus tyranny. Candace Owens, right, living proof that this grift transcends race and gender while monetizing the same grievance pipeline. Matt Walsh, Michael Knowles, other Daily Wire cultural warriors. Right, moral panic as retention strategy. The left wants your children. Christianity is under attack. Men are disappearing. Right, promote and monetize panic and paranoia to drive subscriptions, keep the audience in a permanent state of alarm and dependence. Dan Bongino and Mark Levin. Rage brokers. Simplify villains, use apocalyptic tones, cross-promote with financial and health sponsors, use moral language of freedom, patriotism, and faith as a shield for a business empire of ads, schemes, grifts, and gold-selling partnerships. Mike Lindell, blend product and prophecy. Package commercial failure as martyrdom, turn each lost retailer into proof of divine calling. Promote conspiracies and corral the fleeceable multitudes all in one place. Tucker Carlson might be the most high-status pseudo-intellectual layer of this ecosystem. Right, he markets skepticism of elites while courting billionaire backers and new media paywalls. His moral rhetoric, they hate you, is identical in structure to the old direct mail copy that Rick Perlstein's essay quotes. It's this us versus them storytelling as brand positioning. Right, right-wing media has largely been financed by cons and grifts, and the crusade is connected with highly dubious commerce. Right, it is the conversion of fear, anxiety, and maladaption into a business model, into an allegiance that leads to revenue. All right. And there's a grift architecture running through almost all of this right-wing media. Invent an existential threat, cast yourself as the moral redeemer, monetize the fear. Right? You've got a seamless merger of ideology, fear, grift. Snake oil is not a side effect, it's the business model.
Now cowed into thinking that that's naughty. There is nothing wrong with saying that. There is nothing hateful about saying that.
Tucker Carlson has stated that President Trump has undermined America First and MAGA by attacking Iran, giving in to neocon ghouls like Mark Levin, while also idiotically arguing that President Trump striking Iran's nuclear facilities would lead to World War III.
I agree with Ben about almost everything, and I find him absolutely unbearable to listen to because I just find his argument so dumb. So Rush Limbaugh, the original architect of the oil in the placenta economy in audio form. So Rush fused the moral crisis narrative with a relentless sales pitch for gold coins, pain relief creams, and home security systems. Right? He sold his listeners a fantasy of insider truth, and then redirected them towards advertisers who promised to protect them from the threats he described. Right? His genius wasn't ideology, it was turning resentment into a consumable lifestyle. Right? Sean Hannity inherited Rush's role. He refined it into a loyalty racket. Right? He tapped into childlike minds, feeding endless moral panic. Every show is a crisis, an election stolen, a border invasion, Christianity under siege. And Sean Hannity's principles will track precisely with Republican power centers and sponsors. He's an everyman defender of freedom and a marketing conduit for the party line, whatever commercial tie-ins keep Fox's ad slots full. Mark Levin, constitutional purist, moral absolutist. Furious monologues pitched at apocalyptic temperature mirror this alarmist vision of civilization besieged. Keeps his listeners in a state of existential panic that makes him susceptible both to his ideology and to the products he sells. His performance of anger is his sales technique. The Constitution is just a prop through which he channels that rage. Glenn Beck pairs the Republic is dying with a commercial cure of gold, survival food, and prepper gear. Right? Beck's world collapses unless you buy his sponsor's miracle solution. Right? He replaces Christian salvation with commercial redemption. His chalkboard conspiracies work the same way the old UN children rights scare letters. Right? Vivid nonsense that keep believers emotionally and financially invested. Michael Savage pitches himself as the intellectual outside doctor who sees the truth others suppress. Right? He captures the tone of that 23-cent heart miracle pitch. His shows fuse pseudo-medical moralizing about liberalism as a mental disorder with xenophobic fear and self-promotion. Right? He uses authority as a marketing hook. Alex Jones, the most grotesque flowering of this strategic alliance of snake oil vendors and conservative true believers. The right-wing talk radio is the oil field in the placenta. It's about the conversion of anxiety into energy and energy into profit. Every ad, every outrage, every call to wake up, patriots, is part of one continuous transaction. The medium trains its audience to mistake adrenaline for enlightenment, loyalty for principle. Truth and a sales pitch grift come in the same sentence, right? You get conservative ideology fused with con artistry, right? You sell fear, moral panic, and exclusive insider claims of various marketing grifts, right? Breitbart website, tabloid tone, exclusive scoops that operate like a perpetual fundraising letter. Every headline screams crisis, border chaos, cultural collapse, liberal tyranny, followed by ads for gold, survival gear, testosterone boosters. Right? Outrage is proof of your virtue. Distrust of mainstream reality and elites and institutions. That shows how intelligent you are. You've got ideology, product placement merging into one emotional transaction.
Spoiler alert, it didn't. Tucker Carlson also said in his interview with Nick Fuentes that the people he hates most in the entire world, more than ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Trans-Tifa, Marxists, rapists, murderers, are Christian Zionists who represent an enormous chunk of the conservative base. According to Tucker Carlson, who admits that he first read the Bible all the way through just 2 years ago, Christians who support a Jewish state of Israel are heretics and blasphemers with a brain virus.
How do you explain Mike Huckabee, Ted Cruz?
So, Gateway Pundit, right? That's pure oil in the placenta energy. Invented enemies, fantasy conspiracies, sensational lies. Keeps readers coming back for the next fix. Constant hysteria, sustaining clicks and ad revenue, accuracy irrelevant. The Federalist, polished language, Ivy League educated contributors, but the same grift logic, right? You got the pseudo-intellectual moral panic. The elites are destroying faith, family, and freedom. You get cultural sophistication and the premium version of snake oil, right? You get to appeal to readers who want to feel thoughtful and sophisticated while inhaling propaganda, right? Draw the audience into an emotional identification, then monetize it through donors and ad partners. Town Hall, pajamas media, hot air, right? All heirs of the Richard Viguerie era direct mail networks. Mix scare copy headlines with list rental clickbait. The left's new war on faith. Learn how to protect your family. The boundary between editorial and sales pitch is gone. Newsmax evolved from this kind of mail list profiteering. It's email blasts loaded with medical quackery and investment schemes wrapped in patriotic language. The ideological and financial con are identical. Epoch Times, spiritual veneer, obsession with Chinese conspiracies, promoting a mystic wingnut great circle of life appeals. You get a package of paranoia as moral enlightenment, and you get to sustain yourself with subscriptions and supplement ads. So the right-wing web runs on this same closed circuit the oil in the placenta essay exposed back in 2012. You invent or inflate a civilizational emergency. You cast yourself as the heroic truth-teller fighting on behalf of the victim. You turn panic into profit through clicks, merchandise, and patriotic investments. So what began as mail fraud in ideological wrapping has become a digital economy of moral panic. The names change, but the placenta still gushes cash. Right? Fox perfected the placenta model on a corporate scale. Right? Fox turned the fusion into $1 billion cable empire. Fox is promoting perpetual crisis. Every hour is an all-out assault on the traditional way of life. Fox creates a narrative of national emergencies that never resolve. The threats shift from Obama to migrants to work schools. The structure stays the same. Fear keeps viewers hooked, and you merchandise the cure, right? You sell the emotional reward of belonging, keep people watching, buying, and voting. Right? They're in the business of producing childlike minds. Fox turns adult citizens into loyal customers who consume outrage as entertainment. Its programming is fear, anger, relief. It's like a drug high. The con and the cause, they're indistinguishable. Got a news outlet that's a political action committee, a donor recruitment arm, and a lifestyle brand. Newsmax is the purified snake oil air. Email grist, miracle cures. Ideology is clickbait, fake empowerment, financial incentives for unreality. Shared DNA. Both networks run on the same operating code. Invent or inflate a crisis, blame an invisible enemy, the liberals, the elites, the globalists, then offer emotional and commercial salvation. Right? Fox and Newsmax are the full-scale institutionalization of the oil in the placenta con. Right? Politics is perpetual panic, journalism as sales pitch, morality is marketing copy. The oil field in the placenta has become the 24-hour news cycle.
And there are a lot like that. John Bolton. I mean, I've known them all. George W. Bush, like Karl Rove. I mean, all people I know personally who I've seen like be seized by this brain virus, and they're not Jewish. Most of them are self-described Christians, and then the Christian Zionists who are, well, Christian Zionists. Like, what is that?
Right.
And I can just say for myself, I dislike them more than anybody. You know, because like what? Because it's Christian heresy, and I'm offended by that as a Christian.
Tucker Carlson has said that he despises American Jews who care about October 7th. We, in his words, don't care about America and also want to get his kids killed in a foreign war.
You know, I've got 4 draft-age children. So if you're playing recklessly, fast and loose with their lives, then I have a right to despise you, and I do. So if you're Nikki Haley, who's running for president, or Ben Shapiro, or half the people I see on television casually mentioning the possibility of nuclear war or sending Americans to fight in the Middle East, or in any way involving us in a war that has nothing to do with prosperity and peace at home, nothing, in other words, to do with us, Americans, then I have a right to call you out and be really offended because it's my family. They live here. It's not a joke to me. There's nothing abstract about it.
But most of all, Tucker Carlson acts as an ideological launderer for other people's evils. Tucker Carlson says many inflammatory things, always buying back just enough of it to appear as though he's not saying what he's clearly saying. He's a master of gaslighting. Tucker Carlson, for example, would never say out loud what Nick Fuentes does. He wouldn't say the things many of his guests say. And so instead, he acts as an ideological launderer. He takes other people's hideous ideas, he softens them, he treats them with love and care, and then he provides them with a massive signal boost. He isn't merely talking to people in good faith, of course. He's promoting certain people and ideas and attacking others. So, for example, he'll ask a series of wildly obsequious questions to Nick Fuentes. He'll even let Nick Fuentes' support for Joseph Stalin slide.
It's actually funny. It was December 18th. I remember because that's an important...
Just unbearable, dumb point scoring there by Ben. Let's get a little bit more sanity here from Heather McDonald.
But, what are the things to watch out for that?
Asked what the best mayors, how he would rank the best mayors of his lifetime, and he put de Blasio as number 1 and David Dinkins as number 2. Dinkins is like the most feckless mayor in New York history. Dinkins, who brought us 2,245 or 2,262 murders in 1990, which then William Bratton, police commissioner, and Rudolph Giuliani, mayor, brought down, eventually started on a trajectory down to 333, which is like an over 80% drop, which is beyond belief. Nobody saw that coming. But thanks to de Blasio pulling back on broken windows policing, on proactive policing.
That's so important. We get to decide our crime rate by how vigorously we find and prosecute and punish people committing violent crime. Right? We could dramatically reduce our murder rate and violent crime rate by putting more resources and more effectiveness into finding, punishing people doing these horrible things.
The streets in New York, the subways, the squalor, the vagrants is really bad.
Yeah.
But here's what I would look at. I mean, to me, the most utterly ludicrous proposal, but at least it's the only novel one that Mamdani put out, because everything else is just hackneyed student socialist newspaper junk about, tax the rich, as Mamdani said in his speech, is putting homeless drop-in centers in the subways, in abandoned retail spaces. This just blows my mind. Wild. This is somebody who has no idea about this population, who buys the myth that, the problem is they don't have housing. No, it's not. The problem is they're drug addicted and chemical and mentally ill.
So Heather McDonald went to graduate school. She was all into all sorts of nonsensical academic fads, but somehow her innate common sense reasserted itself. And so people can fall into fads, but if there's just a part of them that values truth, right, they can reorient themselves. And for a smart, highly educated woman, she has a keen eye for reality. Right? She's doing the Lord's work here.
And guess what? When you combine drug addiction and mental illness, you get a huge increase in violence.
Of course.
It's absolutely a toxic brew, and that's what we're seeing. On a weekly basis, we are still getting people pushed in the subways, whacked, the knockout game on the street. It's a statistical certainty, as you say, Ari. It's another statistical certainty, not just that there'll be a cop shooting, but there will be, in the next week, somebody will be pushed by a vagrant or hit, stabbed, and the politicians, in doing nothing about that, are complicitous in that violence. So when you start to see these people, so you can't even, if you're going to a subway with one of these drop-in shelters, you're not just likely to see a vagrant, you're guaranteed. To me, that's going to be like the symbol of New York giving in to fantasies.
So a profound, important difference between left and right down through history is the trad, the right-winger, much more in favor of punishment, harsher punishment, even if the punishment contains vengeance, and the left and the progressive, much less interested in punishment, much more interested in rehabilitation. Now, sometimes rehabilitation, I'm sure, is more effective than punishment. So I'm not one who claims the right-wing approach is always the most adaptive. We have both left and right in politics because these different approaches have proved to have differential fitness, evolutionary fitness in different situations. So some situations, a left-wing approach will be more adaptive, and in other situations, a right-wing approach will be more adaptive. I have a bias, I'm right-wing. I want to severely punish people who commit violent crime. Right? I'm less interested in rehabilitating them.
Fantasies about victimhood, about the evil power of capitalism on the downtrodden, as far as like rental foreclosed apartments that because the owners can't afford to make repairs any longer with the 4-year rent freeze, which is absurd. That's sort of harder to see, but I think the data is going to show that there's going to be less units on the market rather than more, because with the rent freeze you can't survive. The landlords are already just absolutely on death's door with these, not allowed to let the market determine what their property is worth. So I think the retail spaces, occupancy loss, and then just the condition of the streets is something to look out for.
You know, in Mamdani's victory speech, people, and it's just it's this repeated lie.
The job after 9/11.
And he leads with being a Muslim a lot. They're worried that we're turning into Sadiq Khan's London.
Yeah.
What do you make?
I guess I would do it as a subset of identity politics generally, which is ridiculous. It is not an accomplishment to be Muslim. It's not an accomplishment to be female or gay or black. None of these things entitle you to anything. And they're, to your original question, what about merit? They're not a proof of merit either. On the other hand, again, I always argue against myself. There is a long, august history of ethnic politics in the United States. One of the great books is
Why is there a long history of august ethnic politics in the United States? Because people are naturally tribal. People naturally want to hang out with people like themselves.
Is H.L. Mencken's autobiography, and it's a trilogy, and the first one is called Happy Days, which discusses his time in Baltimore growing up, and it's just an extraordinary chronicle of sort of late-ish 19th century America, and also the free-range kids, the boys that are able to just like roam across the city raising hell. Yeah. But he talks about the ethnic appeals of the mayor, that just goes, and he, with any group he's talking to, he is now Irish, or he's now Polish, or he's now Lithuanian. It's like that great song from Candide of the old lady, I'm Spanish now, I'm suddenly.
I'm not proud that I cheated my way through chemistry class in high school, but I do recall that if you put certain chemical elements together, they explode, and other chemical elements, you put them together and they do good things. And so too with peoples and circumstances and situations, right? It's not eternal universal that if you put this group and that group together, they always explode, but certain combinations of diversity produce many wonderful effects, and other combinations of diversity in a different situation are an absolute disaster. So some groups combine nicely in certain situations, and then the combination of these same groups in a different circumstance will turn deadly.
Spanish. So, that's America has always thought of itself that way. I think it goes too far. I think that there is a core identity that should be preserved, that comes out of Europe, that is an Anglo-European.
So when there's no longer a solid majority core, that can make those who feel like they are moving from majority status to minority status highly anxious. And when you no longer have a shared unified hero system, when you no longer building a society out of maximizing the things we have in common with each other, that's very destabilizing.
Tradition, and to pretend that that has no relevance to the ability of a culture to cohere and to feel a unity, I think is a myth.
Is that identity Christian too, would you say? You just said Anglo?
Yes, I speak as a non-believer, but I think it is. Yeah. And to pretend otherwise is...
So an increasingly racially and ethnically diverse America was knit together in part by a shared respect for Christianity. like all sorts of groups that don't get along naturally find ways to get along when they share Christianity.
Just rewriting history. So Robert Putnam, a left-wing sociologist, infamously did from his perspective, a study that showed that the more diverse a community is, the less trust, the less volunteering, people, hunker down, and diversity is not our strength, to be perfectly honest. That's.
It depends. Like, diversity is not just the one same thing, right? Depends on the type of diversity and the situation wherein the diversity is booming or receding. Right? The world is a complicated place, and different peoples combine together excellently or disastrously depending on the nature of the peoples and the nature of the situation.
That's a myth that many people embrace, but I don't think it's actually true. So what you do with the Muslim stuff, it's very tough. It sort of
So non-Muslims have a right to ask which developed economies became more free, more prosperous, right? Which ones benefited from a massive influx of Muslim immigration? Like, which Muslim majority countries would I like to see my country become more like? Right? Different groups have a right to inquire, how will the increasing numbers of your group, right? How will that affect me? Right? We affect each other, and the more that your group can contribute to the common good, right, the more highly your group will be prized. Immigrants to America from Northeast Asia have overwhelmingly been a substantial blessing to the United States. And on the back of that good behavior, they receive a great deal of respect. Mexican Americans, Latino Americans who work hard and contribute to society are respected. And Latinos have a good reputation among many people because so many of say, non-Latinos interactions with Latinos have been positive. But if the interactions are increasingly negative, then people will change their views of Latinos or any other outgroup.
Shows immigration has gone very far. And the people that have always been arguing that we should be open borders are some of those advocates are now, I think, facing a little bit of a wake-up call here. And I'm going to be honest, it's an overlap with liberal Jews that have been in favor of a maximal immigration policy. And if they haven't learned through the pro-Hamas hysteria that their intersectional allies hate them, they really should start learning that now.
Yeah. Let me ask you, this is a sort of more of a political than a policy type question. I mean,
yeah, you don't have to say, let me ask you. Just ask the damn question, guy. Come on, man.
Wokeness
Helen Andrews
is feminization. It is feminine patterns of behavior and group dynamics applied to institutions that had previously operated by more masculine rules of group dynamics. Our institutions changed radically in 2020. Wokeness really did mark a significant departure in how our institutions function.
A rolling back or a reversal?
Hey, Freddie.
So let's just lay it out for our audience. Wokery is to do with too many women. Is that the argument?
Too many is a strong way of putting it, but if I can phrase it in a less inflammatory way right off the bat, I believe that future historians will be debating for decades, if not centuries, why the summer of woke occurred when it did. What happened to produce the mass hysteria that was the summer of 2020 and tapering off for a few years after that? In the same way that today we debate what caused the Salem witch trials. Well, I enjoyed floating various theories to explain wokeness in my own mind to make sense of it to myself. But as soon as someone proposed in an essay the following theory, everything clicked into place for me. Wokeness is feminization. It is feminine patterns of behavior and group dynamics applied to institutions that had previously operated by more masculine rules of group dynamics. And to check this hypothesis against the facts, all you have to do is look at the demographics of various professions and institutions. Many of them tipped over from being majority male to majority female in the decade or even the 5 years leading up to wokeness. Law schools, for example, tipped from being majority male to majority female in 20.
So Helen Andrews might have some good points here. Not saying her overall theory is correct, but I get the sense when I'm reading Helen Andrews or listening to Helen Andrews that I'm encountering sometimes something that is profound, as opposed to the packaged pseudo-profundity of Ben Shapiro, Tucker Carlson and company.
2016. The New York Times tipped over to being majority female in its staff in 2018. Medical schools, the white-collar workforce overall, just so many of the basic bedrock institutions of society demographically feminized right around the same time that they developed the, I would say, pathologies of wokeness. And so the fact that what wokeness entails so resembles feminine group dynamics, that can't be a coincidence. So that's my theory, that the one caused the other.
Okay, so let's just try and explain. I mean, I can't count the number of definitions of woke that we've had on this show over the past 5 years, but I guess you're meaning not so much the sort of radical political ideas as the atmosphere of
career, because I argue for a living, is the idea that disagreement is a personal affront. That if you disagree with me, I take offense at that. Now, for me, my belief has always been that if I disagree with you, that's a sign of respect. If I'm arguing with you, that's how I show respect. That conflict is not necessarily something that should be minimized. Sometimes conflict is a good thing. Certainly in terms of debate, rational debate, conflict is the essence of that. What we saw during the woke era was this new idea that if you're disagreeing with someone's position, you are questioning their humanity or invalidating their lived experience. Wokeness was a way of shutting down conflict rather than living with conflict.
So you listen to Helen Andrews, you get depth at times. Right? Not every word is nectar from the lips of God. With Ben Shapiro and Nick Fuentes, you get the podcasting equivalent of a genre novelist. And there are many similarities between these two and their careers, right? They both took off as teens, right? Ben was a teenage pundit prodigy writing columns for Town Hall and Creator Syndicate. Nick Fuentes was a teenage live streamer railing about Trump, race, and the right. They both packaged their convictions as competence. They were both great at performance. They were both hyperverbal, rapid fire. They displayed certainty that overwhelmed slower thinkers, right? They replaced profundity and depth with pseudo-profundity and fluency. And the midwit audience mistook their fluency for intelligence, right? Both rose by flattering their followers. Ben told conservatives, "You're the rational adults in a world of hysterical leftists," while refusing to debate substantial intellectual leftists. Nick Fuentes tells alienated, marginalized losers, young men, that they're really the brave truth tellers in a world of cowardly boomers. So each offers membership in a club of those who get it. Right? That's how they hooked their midwit demographic. People bright enough to crave intellectual validation, but not smart enough to see through the simplifications and the propaganda. They share the same rhythms: fast talk, logical sounding structures, theatrical indignation. Ben Shapiro weaponizes debate club polish. Nick Fuentes uses meme irony and gamer charisma. Both exploit the modern attention economy with their short clips, reactive outrage, instant feedback. Neither had to grow up to become a public figure. They both demonstrate a stunted seriousness. Their genius is not in wisdom or profundity, it's in marketing. They learned early that most people don't want to think, they just want someone to think for them. When you listen to Helen Andrews, you have to think.
And that's a pattern that psychologists have observed in differences between men and women. And to clarify something that's caused a lot of people a lot of confusion and trouble in evaluating this argument for themselves, it's not so much differences in individual men and women in terms of their tastes, but group dynamics, how male predominant groups behave versus groups that are majority female.
So as America becomes more diverse and has more hero systems, all sorts of things that were once sacred are no longer sacred. the moral capital of past suffering decays with time. So groups like Jews and blacks and other victimized groups lose the deference that was once purchased by their suffering. So the Holocaust and slavery shaped many taboos in American discourse, but that moral immunity is perishable. Public patience with sanctified victimhood is running low. In this coming era, groups are judged by their overall consistent behavior and their power, not by inherited grievance. Right? This isn't malice necessarily. It's a normal rebalancing of identity politics. It is a recognition that the old moral hierarchies have lost their force. History keeps moving, even when people still want to trade on it. And Judeo-Christian is an incredibly unstable thing. It's amazing that this term lasted as long as it did with as much capital in America. Right? Judeo-Christian was always a political fiction. It was an alliance word, not a theological one. It was a way of papering over irreconcilable differences because it served a purpose. You built Cold War unity against communism and atheistic secular totalitarianism. It was a way for Protestants and Catholics and Jews to share a moral front, to present together that they were fighting the real enemy of atheistic communism, not each other. In reality, if you're a believing Christian, then Judaism and Islam are very likely to appear satanic to you, and vice versa. So Judeo-Christian was a winning formula for a few generations because it fit the moment. Now, the scaffolding that held up Judeo-Christian, shared patriotism, the Soviet threat, the post-war consensus is gone, and the right's populist edge sees Judeo-Christian as globalist code for interfaith managerialism, where interfaith dialogue is used to neuter the distinctive faith claims of Christianity in particular. So it's amazing that Judeo-Christian lasted 70 years in America. Right? Most fake, fictional, synthetic moral systems collapse much faster. So Judeo-Christian America was not so much a faith, but a truce, and the truce held until the Cold War ended and Trump rose. People don't like being manipulated, and Judeo-Christian was manipulation. So the United States has had all sorts of noble-sounding fictional moral visions that were useful as strategic self-interest. We had manifest destiny, right? There was God's will for America to dominate and expand. There was the white man's burden. It was the duty of the white man to dominate the world. You had the Soviet Union selling proletarian internationalism, right? Communism was a universal moral mission to liberate the workers. World War I was a war to make the world safe for democracy. Never again, the post-Holocaust moral consensus. Right? It also served as insulation for whatever Israel was doing, and for Jewish elites seeking safety and cultural protection in the West. Black Lives Matter began as a plea for justice, quickly became a grift. Free markets bring freedom. Right? You get to liberate yourself from tyranny while gutting the domestic manufacturing industry and allowing global elites to make enormous profits. The fight against misinformation, right? Pitched as a defense of truth, but operated as narrative control, protecting establishment credibility and the claims of experts. Now, one effective tool that Nick Fuentes uses is abductive logic. So abductive logic means detective logic. You construct the most plausible sounding narrative to fit the available facts, and if you can do this better than official narratives, or at least feel that way to your audience, it's a winning formula. So Nick will start with anomalies, right? He will point to something real and unsettling, immigration trends, demographic change, disproportionate representation, elite hypocrisy, and say, see, nobody can explain this honestly, right? He will present a mystery that begs for an explanation. Then he will offer a single unifying cause. Right? Media bias, declining birth rates, endless war, foreign lobby. He will then use pattern matching, not data. He'll gesture to these recurring coincidences, the same surnames, the same ideology, the same institutions, and he'll apply design. We prefer agency over randomness, so his insights feel profound. He will redefine what is false. Every counterexample will become proof. If you say he's wrong and show that he is saying something factually wrong, well, his narrative cannot be disproven. It just explains your denial. So he grounds his narratives in the emotional affect, not in facts or logic or analysis. Right? He will use a mocking, ironic, certain tone that gives his abductive leap emotional authority. People remember how his claims feel more than whether they're true or logical. Then he will mix valid insight with poison. So often his starting premises are true. There is elite corruption, there is media bias, there are rational reasons why there's demographic anxiety. Then he'll make the abductive leap. Therefore, the globalists, the Jews, are conspiring against us. So to effectively debunk him, you must concede the truth of what he says and then tackle the lies. So to break the Nick Fuentes abductive logic narrative spell, you must apply a better explanation, a better narrative, not just a negation. People will not abandon this type of abductive reasoning till there is a better story that makes more emotional, intuitive, and logical sense.
It would not be fair to, or it would be reductive to say that men like argument and women are more conflict averse. That may be true in general terms, but there are plenty of exceptions. There are plenty of women who like conflict and plenty of men who can't stand it. But when you're talking about groups that are majority male versus groups that are majority female, it is a lot more consistent and fair and true to the facts to say that, look, groups that are majority female tend to operate by these HR type rules of you can't ruffle anybody's feathers and you have to lather any criticism in layers and layers of compliments and you have to avoid conflict and be more consensus based. And at the level of the group, that does tend to apply.
Because it's a little bit more than just that sort of cliche, isn't it? That maybe men are more rational and women more emotional, which I think many men have probably used in an insulting way to women, and many of our female listeners may. And conflicts, there's a different approach between.
Upon, as I was pursuing this line of inquiry for myself, was a book called Warriors and Worriers by a psychologist named Joyce Benenson. And I tend dispositionally to be skeptical of evolutionary psychology arguments. I personally do bristle at the idea that what I do and
so why would she be skeptical, and where would people, very smart people like Helen Andrews, bristle at evolutionary psychology? Because it reduces their power and influence. Evolutionary psychology is pretty simple. It says either a trait or a practice, right, serves an adaptive fitness function, or it is not real. It's not true, right? It is like a knife through hot butter. It's a very easy way to spot the BS. And if it is correct and largely correct or accurate, it is such a profound tool that it reduces the power of other types of analysis, right? Evolutionary psychology is so powerful that once you start studying, you feel like it explains everything that people do. And that then reduces the prestige and the status of people like Helen Andrews.
And how I behave has anything to do with cavemen or, our ancestors on the savannah. But in this case, I think her argument resonated with me because it reflected things I've seen and experienced myself. She said that men developed rules of interpersonal behavior adapted to war and conflict with other tribes, whereas women developed rules of behavior consistent with conflict within the tribe and with particularly their female rivals. The example of that difference that I think clicks most easily for people, or at least that I find that most ordinary people today recognize most easily, is that men are much more likely than women to have a concept of the honorable opponent, to be able to fight someone bitterly, even to the death in war, and yet at the end of it, be able to shake their hand and say, I respect you, and say, good game, fellow, and return to.
That's why Carl Schmitt would say your enemy is not necessarily immoral or evil or ugly. Your enemy threatens your survival. Your enemy is not necessarily a morally bad or intellectually inferior or aesthetically ugly entity. The enemy is that which threatens your survival.
To some kind of basic status quo of, yes, we were fighting to the death a moment ago, but I nevertheless respect you and honor you, and I'm willing to operate within rules of conflict, and the conflict's over, and now that it's done, we can be friends again. Women tend to be slower to reconcile. I was surprised but pleased to discover that this is true even in primate species, that when they observe the behavior of chimpanzees, that females who get into conflict are slower to reconcile with their female rivals than males. I don't know, there must be something to it if even chimps are doing it. But women tend to not have that attitude of good game, let's shake hands and put bury this conflict, bury the hatchet. Women tend to simmer and continue conflicts indefinitely. And Joyce Benenson offered her evolutionary psychology reasons for why that might be the case in the difference between how men and women handle conflict. But whether or not her explanation for why it's true is valid or not, I think that most people would accept that it is true.
Right, because I think a lot of people, when they think about woke ideas and the atmosphere around them, would say that there's nothing very soft or consensual about woke ideology. It's really, if you're on the wrong side of it, you are never forgiven. It's a very harsh way of thinking, you might say. How does that square?
That's true. I think people very easily fall into the trap of thinking in simplistic terms that men like conflict and women are conflict averse. Well, that is true in some senses, but it would be a mistake to infer from that women don't fight or that women don't engage in conflict. They do, very much so, sometimes more than men. It's a difference in the way that conflict plays out. I referred a moment ago to the concept of the honorable opponent and standing up and fighting someone to the best of your ability and then accepting the outcome of that conflict, however it might go. That is the thing that wokeness is missing. Instead of, if you're a wokester and you've identified somebody in your...
So in 2014, 2015, 2016, we had the rise of the alt-right. And then in 2018 with Charlottesville, you had the collapse of the alt-right. And who knew that Nick Fuentes would be the most well-known, famous survivor of this movement? So back in 2015, 2016, 2017, Mike Enoch and the Right Stuff Network were at the center of the alt-right podcast scene. And then this group largely collapsed under a mixture of exposure, infighting, and post-Charlottesville fallout. So Enoch had a podcast called The Daily Shower, blending humor, racism, trolling, pseudo-intellectual commentary. It had tens of thousands of listeners. It created all sorts of terms like merchant memes and echo parentheses. And TRS was a hub linking Richard Spencer's identitarian politics with 4chan's edgy online culture. Then in January 2017, left-wing activists revealed that Mike Enoch, the loudest anti-Semite in the movement, was married to a Jewish woman. This challenged and devastated his credibility with many people. He briefly quit. His wife left him. He returned within weeks. He claimed redemptive zeal. Then Charlottesville, was it August 2017? You had the Unite the Right rally. And Enoch was there. TRS lost platforms like PayPal, Twitter, YouTube, lost advertisers, lost morale. Richard Spencer pivoted to self-parody. Enoch's crew turned inward. They produced paywalled content for a small base. They distanced themselves from Nazism, but they kept pushing an ethno-state ideology under euphemisms. So they were banned from mainstream platforms. They survived on their own site and fringe streaming services like DLive and Odyssey. Their audience shrank to a few thousand paying subscribers. Their tone hardened. Less irony, more siege mentality. So TRS exists, but it's culturally irrelevant. The energy and the youth have moved to newer figures like Nick Fuentes, BAP, and others who borrow the showmanship, but ditch the overt swastika baggage. So TRS is now seen as a boomer-era internet fascism, lost the plot. Mike Enoch is still around, still streaming behind a paywall, but his moment has passed. The movement that he helped midwife has migrated from long podcasts for angry millennials to meme politics for Gen Z. Now, one interesting thing about the TRS crew is that so many of them have been married or are married, and that shapes their politics in subtle ways. So they were older than the Nick Fuentes crew. They were domesticated. Their ideology was more paradoxical. Their wives humanized them and constrained them. They developed a certain tone out of the strictures of married life, resentful, weary, knowing, like long drunken riffs about degenerate culture, coming from their middle-aged exhaustion more than their fanaticism. So they were less insurgents, they were burned out, married men trying to talk their way into meaning. And it set the stage for their eclipse. So by 2020, the right-wing energy was youthful, online, ironic, sexually frustrated, and Nick Fuentes' unmarried, no girls allowed politics felt more pure, more useful to a generation that saw the TRS guys as hypocrites with wives and double lives. So the TRS marriages mattered. It made them human enough to be funny, too normal to sustain a cult like Nick Fuentes's, right? Their ideology was a performative outrage from men negotiating the contradictions of adulthood, wanting the benefits of domestic life, while imagining themselves as exiled warriors for the West.
Your university department or in your business who has stepped outside the lines or violated the taboos of wokeness, what you do is you don't do what masculine rules of conduct would indicate, which would be to fight that person or dispute that person, say, I disagree with you and here's why, let's have an argument. Instead, you ostracize that person, say, I can't even believe you just said that. Wow. And shut down conversation and exclude that person from even the realm of things you're willing to debate. That, to me, was the biggest pathology of wokeness. It made it impossible to discuss any topic on which wokeness developed taboos, which turned out to be quite a lot of things that are very important for a democratic society to be able to debate. So yes, of course, wokeness is very much engages in conflict. It just does it in what is, to me, a toxic and unhealthy way.
I'm glad you're saying this, not me, but you're suggesting that actually the exclusionary tactic is more feminine than masculine as a way to get past disagreement. One specific real-world example you talk about in this essay was the Larry Summers oustings. This is in the pre-woke almost era. This is looking back to 2005 when the word woke hadn't even been invented. Tell us about what happened to him and why you think it's relevant here.
Larry Summers was the president of Harvard University, which made him one of the 10 most powerful people in America. He was extremely well-connected. He was an extremely illustrious and well-respected economist, very academically capable as a scholar on his own terms. He was also very politically connected. He had served in the Clinton administration in the 90s. Really just a towering pillar of the establishment. He was invited in that capacity to speak to a conference on women's representation in science.
That must have been an exciting conference. So you may ask, what the hell happened to Richard Spencer? So the last 4 years have been a long fade from notoriety to irrelevance, with a few strange reinventions along the way. He's trying to create a new religion. The Science versus Kessler civil trial consumed him. He went pro se, he declared bankruptcy, he was wiped out financially, he was radioactive even among allies, he lost his home in Montana, moved into rentals, he began doing consulting and sporadic Substack posts. He disavowed the alt-right, he calls his past a failed avant-garde, he branded himself post-nationalist, post-right, he promoted Joe Biden and the Democrats. He would flirt with reactionary and Nazi themes, but he framed them as religious and philosophical rather than racial. He turned towards safer ground like aesthetics and European high culture. He praised Emmanuel Macron and Putin's diplomacy. He began tweeting opera clips and writing about Eurasian humanism. He was reinstated by Twitter under Elon Musk. He stopped posting for racial separation and agitation, but to troll the right, he'd attacked Trump, MAGA, Nick Fuentes, and Christian nationalism. He presented himself as an urbane critic of American conservatism, aligned rhetorically with centrists and cultural progressives. He rebranded himself as an ironic liberal, called himself a Biden Democrat, a liberal authoritarian. He was partly trolling, partly genuine disgust with the right's populist lower IQ drift. He praised vaccinations, supported Ukraine, mocked Christian fascists. Liberals still saw him as a Nazi in a turtleneck. Currently runs a low-traffic Substack and occasionally hosts spaces on Platform X, lives between Montana and Northern Virginia, has no organized following left, just a small circle of nostalgia watchers and people studying the alt-right's collapse. So he moved from racial, revolutionary, and self-styled aesthete to contrarian liberal, less David Duke, more Oscar Wilde lop. So his ideology collapsed, his movement collapsed, but his ego survived. The performance continues, minus the audience. And then Mark Brahman is his main sidekick. They're trying to create a new religion together called Apolloism. Right, it's a renewal of alt-right 3.0. You've got Greco-Roman gods like Apollo. You've got racial and masculine excellence for young Aryan men. There's creation of Richard Spencer's Alex University. They're trying to build a meta-political mythic symbolic system merging classical myth, white identity, masculinity, anti-modern critique. They treat art and film as coded moral text. They claim to decode the hidden symbolic language of culture. Richard provides the name recognition and political cachet. Brahman supplies the theology. So it feels like and looks like a religion with Nazi-adjacent features, right? They evoke the gods, the rituals, the destinies, the purifications, and the structure of religion. The target audience is alienated young men looking for purpose. So this Apolloism offers these men initiation and secret knowledge. You've got socially acceptable levels of racial and masculine doctrine. You've got a fusion of mythic and racial thinking. You've got whiteness as a divine lineage. You've got masculinity as a heroic order. You've got modernity as decay. You've got a disguised racial hierarchy and a purification theme echoing classic fascism. You've got anti-Christian theory because Christianity is universalist and it's got a slave morality. You've got a favoring of pagan and classical symbols. You've got a racialized neo-pagan faith that separates itself from Christianity and the West. So Apolloism is Richard's next stage of white identity politics. 1.0 was white nationalism, 2.0 was the alt-right, 3.0 is Apolloism. So there's a sense of historic mission and spiritual evolution. So it's a way to sanitize Nazism, extremism, make it appear intellectual. So Mark Brahman is the esoteric half of Richard Spencer's latest venture. Less political party, more church. So like many Zionists, I love watching documentaries on Israeli military triumphs and crying. It's easier than doing the hard work of traditional Judaism, performing demanding rituals, studying demanding religious texts. It's a cheap spiritual high. Studying Talmud is a difficult spiritual high. So there's a much bigger audience of people who traffic in pseudo-profundity rather than the real thing.
And he said at the beginning of his remarks, you know, when the organizer invited me to come here, I said, I've got two versions of this speech. I can give you the nice one, where I tell you all the great things that Harvard is doing to improve female representation in science departments, or I can give you a genuine, sincere, off-the-cuff rumination on why I think women remain underrepresented in science. I can give you the real talk. I can, you know, the fuzzy bureaucratic one or the real one. And he said he wanted the real one, so here it is. And he proceeded to give what was actually fairly mainstream assessment of male and female differences when it comes to the hard sciences. He said that men are more likely to be represented out at the tail end of the ability bell curve. So you have more men than women who are way in the top 0.1% of scientific ability. And that also women tend to be less interested in these systematizing scientific topics than men. So even women who are extremely intellectually capable tend, as a matter of taste, to be more interested in more humanities and personal focused fields. There were some women in the audience when Larry Summers gave this talk and made those points.
I mean, it's worth saying, I'm sorry to interrupt, Helen, it's just,
yes,
it almost feels nostalgic, doesn't it, to think of a world where you could wade into the question of the heritability of IQ or skills or talents in different fields and not realize that this is an unexploded bomb. I mean, anyone in the years since would be tiptoeing around and would just steer clear of it. But there was Larry Summers in the golden days of 2005 just thinking he'd rip it.
Well, one of the most important aspects of this story is that he thought he was off the record. He was off the record. And the rules of off the record say that you can't take quotes from somebody's off the record speech.
So my father did a big controversial speech on, I believe, Yom Kippur on a Saturday afternoon of 1979 when he was a professor at Pacific Union College, Seventh-day Adventist College in the Napa Valley. He gave this big controversial talk at an entity called Adventist Forum, where it was supposed to be a way to have free speech within Seventh-day Adventism. And so my father thought he was shielded from negative reactions to him going on to demolish the foundational central principle of chosenness, that the Seventh-day Adventist Church was specially chosen by God. He demolished this essential doctrine of the church, and as a result, there was a kerfuffle. Tapes of his talk were sent all over the world, and he ended up losing his position, and my whole family then moved out of Seventh-day Adventism, but thought he was shielded, effectively, that this was off-the-record talk.
And hand them to a journalist. But one of the classic differences between men and women is that men are more likely to be invested in rules, whereas women are more likely to focus on the outcome that they want, that they think is going to be best, and kind of fudge the rules to get their way to the outcome that they want. And that's, whether or not you accept that's true of men and women in general, certainly in this case, the women ignored the off-the-record rule, took Larry Summers' quotes to a feminist journalist, and stirred this up into a massive national scandal. And the thing that was so dismaying for those of us who remember watching it unfold at the time is that these women who were trying to get Larry Summers fired, and as they eventually did not offer any arguments. They did not try and say that what Larry Summers said was wrong on the facts. What they said in the quotes that they gave to the New York Times was, "I was so offended I couldn't even breathe. I had to leave or I would have passed out." And I'm sitting there thinking, you're not really beating the allegations that you're emotional rather than rational, ladies. Feminist hysteria managed to unseat one of the most powerful people in the United States from one of the most valuable positions simply on the basis of being offended without even trying to argue that what he had said was wrong.
So by that account, the ousting of Larry Summers was a sort of early example of this. Not only was it about the differences between men and women, it epitomized the differences between men and women. But I just got to push back a little bit, I feel, on behalf of those of our listeners who might be not enjoying this. First of all, are you sure that they were all women involved in the ousting of Larry Summers? I feel like if you did a full forensic study, there's bound to be some blokes involved in that story.
Yes, and in fact, there is a journalist, I believe, named Richard Bradley, who wrote a book about Larry Summers' tenure as president of Harvard. And it is important to state for the record that over 1 year elapsed between the speech he gave that got him in so much trouble and his eventual resignation. It is also important to stipulate that there were many, many other controversies that Larry Summers got himself into in the course of his Harvard presidency. He antagonized powerful members of the faculty. He antagonized the Black Studies department and kind of put his foot in it politically there as well, and made various budget changes that people didn't like. Larry Summers, if you don't know him,
Right.
he's famously a guy who's pretty brash and.
And Bob says, I think I'm shielded behind my Anon account, but probably there are electronic traces all over the internet, and any dedicated organization could probably find my real name. So everywhere we go, we leave a trail, right? Everything leaks out. That doesn't mean there's no point in preserving anonymity. It doesn't mean there's no point ever in hiding anything, but there is an innate tendency in life for things to leak. And everywhere we go, we are like snails. We leave this greasy trail.
Blunt and not in it. He's not here to make friends. Larry Summers is. So certainly there were many controversies that led to his eventual resignation. He was not fired. He resigned. But I think a fair assessment would say that the remarks about women in science were the straw that broke the camel's back. If you had to name one thing that caused his resignation, that would be the one thing people would pick.
I said that some people were upset by your essay. One such person was Kathy Young over at the Bullock. We haven't asked her on the show, so let me read out some of her remarks and you can respond to them. She says, Andrews has waded into this morass with an ultra-simplistic message for those on the right. Everything they hate in modern American culture can be blamed on women, or at least on women's social and political empowerment and their large-scale entry into public life. That message seems to be quite popular. Andrews' talk was reportedly the big hit of NatCon. You did a speech, kind of version of this at the National Conservatism Conference, and the video got 170,000 views. So she's saying you're just bashing on, you're beating up on women, you're blaming women for everything that's wrong with the world, and it's a cheap shot and it's not fair, and she doesn't recognize it, and she's pissed. What do you say to Kathy?
Kathy Young has become one of my most dedicated haters. Anytime I write anything, controversial or otherwise, she tends to pop up from the lob peanuts from the cheap seats. So, hi, Kathy. Thank you for being my most dedicated reader. In terms of the substance of her argument, I think the most important response I would give is this. Other people who are skeptical of feminism, going back all the way to Phyllis Schlafly, took gender differences as their starting point and then asked, given that these are the differences between men and women, what are likely to be the changes in our institutions? How is this likely to play out if institutions tip to being majority female? The important thing about the article I wrote and the position I am taking is that I did not take gender differences as my starting point. I began with the observation that our institutions changed radically in 2020. Wokeness really did mark a significant departure in how our institutions function. So given this huge, unprecedented, otherwise inexplicable, massive social change called wokeness, what could possibly be the explanation for that? So I didn't start with gender differences and saying men and women are different, therefore I think more ladies is going to be a disaster. I started with observing a disaster and asking what could possibly explain it. And I think that the most simple explanation is feminization.
Yeah, and you come up with some quite convincing dates here. Law schools became majority female in 2016. The New York Times, as you mentioned, became majority female in 2018. Medical schools became majority female in 2019. And overall, the college-educated workforce became majority female in 2019. A lot of people, I think, women or men, would hear those statistics and feel like that was something to celebrate. They might say, okay, maybe the way that these institutions work has changed. Maybe there are some negative aspects to that. But overall, it's a positive because it means greater participation. It means they will reflect the communities they're serving better, etc. You know what the arguments are. Do you also see some positives in the additional presence of women in the workplace?
It depends on the field. I think there are some fields that are very much enhanced by female representation. I am basing my judgments of whether increasing feminization is a good thing or a bad thing based not on speculation about how I think women tend to be, but on observation about how increasing feminization has affected these institutions so far. In the case of the field of law, that is one area where I see the areas of law that are most female-dominated, including law revolving around sexual assault and the Me Too movement. And in the case of campus courts to adjudicate cases of sexual assault, the so-called Title IX courts that arose under President Obama, that is kind of a sort of perfect experiment. That's a legal system designed.
So have you been accident prone, or have you known people who are accident prone? It's a curious thing, and much of my audience comes here for the sturdy defense of Israel. So let's talk about Israel and Hamas. Hamas isn't surrendering, it's evolving. And the host of the podcast Call Me Back is Dan Senor.
Sometimes it can be a pain in the neck, always having to travel with a microphone and have your gear. There was a time when we did this where it was only in audio. There was no video, which is when I agreed to sign up to podcasts. It was a simpler time. It was just audio, but now we're on video, and I should acknowledge that if those watching on video, including you seeing me on video, are wondering why I'm banged up, I have learned, and Jonathan, you have children who play sports. My son plays tackle football, and Campbell and I always thought that the dangerous part of tackle football for our family would be our son playing, not us watching in the stands. But
so there's a liberal reform day school, Stephen S. Wise day school, the Milken School, largely or substantially funded by Michael Milken. And I remember back in something like 2009, 2010, the head of the school said they were thinking of starting a tackle football program, which is almost inconceivable for a Jewish day school. I don't know if they ever did do that.
I was the dutiful father trying to get a key video angle at his game on Friday, and
So this would not be a problem in Orthodox Jewish life because you don't have you don't have so many football leagues in Orthodox Jewish life. But then Senor is not Orthodox, and so that gives him a lot more flexibility, gives him a lot more freedom, he has a lot more choice. But freedom comes with a price, right? You have more room to make catastrophic choices.
I won't go into the gory details, but I jumped up on something to get a better angle. I might add, at my wife's urging. She was saying I need to get a better angle.
Right, there's less beating the ego, right? The more traditional you go in religion, including in the Jewish religion, the less socially acceptable it is to put a priority on ego display and getting the great angle of your kid playing a sport, right? From a traditional Jewish perspective, this is just nonsense.
And I splattered, and I'll spare our viewers and our listeners from the gory details, but let's just say I spent the better part of the weekend in the hospital. I'm going to be okay, but it does look like I was the one playing football rather than.
So freedom isn't some unambiguous gift. So what's going on with Hamas?
And I think that's where they're aiming for, to take over the Palestinian national movement and basically climb up to the diplomatic level and continue the struggle from there. I don't think Hamas...
Yeah, think about how many old men get seriously injured or die climbing onto their roofs to try to clean out the gutters.
Gave up on an inch of its overall agenda of, zero Jewish sovereignty in the state of Israel.
But before October 7th, 2023, this is not how Hamas operated, just to be clear, right? This is a real evolution or a real modernization of how Hamas...
This is something I don't understand. What kind of kid wants his parents at his athletic event, theatrical event, or anything? The last thing in the world I would have ever wanted would be my parents to show up at one of my events. My happiest memories as a kid were when I was the farthest away from my parents. I don't understand parents who show up to their kids' events. I don't understand kids who want their parents to show up to events. I don't understand the cliche plot point in countless TV shows and movies, and I assume fiction, about how hurt the kid is that the parent didn't show up for their birthday party. The last thing in the world I would ever want would be for my parents to show up to a birthday party or my play or my athletic event. It just strikes me as so weird.
Thinks of itself in terms of interacting with Palestinian society.
It's Hamas's fourth morphing. Let me maybe parallel this so folks who are listening would understand. Let me take an example from the corporate world, right? Think about Google, that everybody knows, right? First iteration, Google does search. They do it so well, by the time everybody else tries to figure out search, Google has already morphed into ads, right? They figured out how to monetize. By the time other, digital groups succeed in monetizing, Google buys YouTube. It becomes a media company, right? By the time people figure out, media, Google buys a small company called Android, steps into mobile phone operating systems, right? And so on and on. If you don't morph very fast in the context of modern counterterrorism, much like it is in the modern digital competition, you don't survive. Hamas has been super adept at that. In the 80s, it's this Muslim Brotherhood, non-national movement. That's how it gains the Israeli Defense Administration.
And this is my exact sentiment. I lived in terror of my parents embarrassing me. Me too. I didn't want to bring my friends over because I was so frequently embarrassed by things that my parents would say or do. The less interaction between my parents and my friends, the better. The most mortifying parts of my earlier life were interactions between the people I valued and my parents. I guess I have this envy of people who are sad when their parent dies. I have this envy of people who, when they were kids, they wanted their parent around for many of these events. It's just so unfathomable to me. And it has nothing to do with my parents being bad. It just, I wanted my own world separate from theirs from about age 8 onward.
Kind of, I would say, allowing them to grow in Gaza predominantly. As they say, we're not national. All we care about is Muslim Brotherhood type. Let us pray. Let us, have social, societal rights. In the 90s, it more.
So Muslim identity can be primarily about the religion, but frequently it's a tribal, coalitional, political identity, just like Judaism can be primarily a religious expression or a tribal identity or an ethnic identity or a nationalist identity, right? The wording, the terminology is not always the real thing, right? The Catholic Protestant divide in Ireland wasn't primarily about theology, wasn't primarily about religion. That was just the marker, the terminology for a deeper ethnic difference. So Nick Fuentes is a Christian nationalist because he realizes it's social suicide to be a racial nationalist. So instead he talks in terms of religion. But when you listen to him and you watch him, it's obvious that he doesn't sacrifice anything for his religion. It's just a linguistic and cultural claim to place himself in a safer position to do and say what he wants.
Morphs into, the suicide bombing entity that we all are familiar with, as it actually calls the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, being basically, traitors of the Palestinian cause because Yasser Arafat goes through the Oslo process. In the 2000s, they step up. They become even more ruthless. But after the disengagement from Gaza, Condoleezza Rice pressures the government of Israel to allow Hamas to run as a political party in the Palestinian Authority, which, by the way, was contrary to the Oslo agreements. This is a terror organization that doesn't accept the state of Israel. It should not have been allowed to run, but there was this concept in D.C., right, saying, let them run, they'll moderate. Hamas definitely runs, presents itself as a, morphs again. It's this third morphing into a political movement.
The idea, I remember these debates in D.C., if Hamas suddenly has to be responsible for being mayor and not martyr, they'll moderate.
Yep. Turkey. So Turkey wants to make Turkey great again. It is engaged in Central Asia with Azerbaijan and all that part. It is operating what it called the Mavi Vatan, which is the strategy of the blue homeland, from the Black Sea all the way to Libya, the Mediterranean, claiming that as its own waters. By the way, severely crippling Israel's ability to export natural gas to Europe. This is already a big issue. And trying to set up the third part of that triangle in Syria, so far without much success, because Israel is insisting on holding on to that veto in order to, have Turkey at bay. And so from Turkey's perspective, there's one proxy that it wants to build, which is in Syria, that is part of that triangle, and Israel's preventing that from happening. The rationale there is that any corridor from east to west has to go through Turkey. That's its official policy. So it wants to own Syria, not related to Israel. That's not the case when it comes to Gaza. Turkey's actions in Gaza are geared to basically allow for Turkey to meddle in what it actually sees as its own backyard, which is Jerusalem. And being the sort of modern host of the Muslim Brotherhood, that's where Turkey is right now vis-a-vis Hamas and vis-a-vis Gaza. It wants to be the guardian of the neo-Hamas.
And what about Qatar?
So Turkey is, in many ways, you could look at Turkey as a genuinely strong and prominent Qatar, right? Qatar, at the end of the day, is a few hundred thousands of indigenous people owning this massive gas fields and building this empire of retainer diplomacy, bribes, and, massive influence campaigns throughout the West. Turkey's an 80 million people country, 1 million babies born each year, $1.5 trillion economy that has no natural resources, massive industrial, military industry capacity. Qatar looks at Turkey and says, we have the money. You guys have 20, 30% inflation each year. You need to weather the difficulties of your economic policy as you kind of stretch into the Middle East. We'll be your bank. You be the infrastructure player, the geopolitical giant that holds the Muslim Brotherhood capacity. And I think that Israel's attack in Qatar actually threw Qatar further into Turkey's hands, because it realized it is, at the end of the day, kinetically, right, a small island. Whereas Turkey is a member of NATO, the biggest army in NATO the biggest military in NATO outside of the US, a country where America allegedly holds nuclear capacities on the ground in Turkey. And so I think Qatar is now kind of looking into this synergy with Turkey that can help it further enhance its global posture.
Also with the decimation of the Iranian regime's offensive military capabilities, not complete decimation, but near decimation, to the extent that Iran was regarded as the most powerful geopolitical player in the region, other than Israel and maybe Saudi Arabia. There's also this sense that Turkey has now, replaced Iran in the region as, I mean, again, you could put Saudi Arabia in proximity to Turkey in terms of its reach, but in terms of its ambition, Turkey is like the new Iran in the region.
It is in a way, and part of the challenge for Israel right now is that, you never win a complete victory, a total victory. Once you win militarily, you're actually exchanging an old set of problems to a new set of problems. And where countries fail over the long term is that they think that the solution to the old problem is going to hold to the new problem. I'll give you an example vis-a-vis Iran. The strategy Israel put in place to deal with Iran had three legs. Diplomatic isolation, Washington, Europe, sanctions to cripple the regime's economic infrastructure, and intelligence operations and kinetic operations on Iranian soil. None of these three can happen in Turkey. I don't think there's anybody who can challenge the DC-Ankara relationship right now. The Tom Barrack dynamics, the American envoy and the ambassador in Ankara is gaining, has incredible sway in the White House. I don't think there's a way to sanction Turkey or to hurt any of its economic activity because Europe depends on Turkey. Just to give you a number here, 27% of Europe's steel is imported. 16%, more than half, is imported from Turkey, right? The entire green revolution, I don't know if you saw last week, Bill Gates walking back from 20 years of a focus on, global warming and so on.
Yeah.
That dynamic created two winners, Turkey and China, right? Turkey is this polluted backbone of the European economy. Everything you want to manufacture in Europe but can't because of green standards ended up in Turkey. So you can't sanction Turkey because Europe depends on Turkey. And the third, Europe is a NATO country. We can't operate kinetically without triggering, Chapter 5. We can't operate on an intelligence basis. We can't collect intelligence in a NATO country, right, in an aggressive way. So we're at the point that none of the three pillars that worked with Iran can actually work with Turkey. And we need to figure out how to, A, leverage assets that we do have, which is India, which is Saudi Emirate relationships, which is the strong position we have in Syria, to drive Turkey into some kind of a modus vivendi, some kind of an equilibrium, and push them out of Gaza. Or, that's a decision that I think Prime Minister Netanyahu will have to consider over the next few weeks, find a way to convince the Turkish regime that, by the way, yesterday also issued an arrest warrant to Prime Minister Netanyahu and to the leadership of the Defense Administration in Israel. So they are not only emboldened, they're pushing the envelope even further. And this is quite a challenge for Prime Minister Netanyahu. This is not something that you solve in one go.
Why is the U.S., from Jerusalem's perspective, why is the U.S. allowing this access to enhance its role in post-war Gaza?
I think it's a broader dynamic. U.S. has its competition with China being, front and center. We saw the Xi Jinping, President Trump session last week, and that's,
So the strategic argument for the United States-Israel partnership on behalf of American interests is that by arming its ally Israel, the United States maintains tremendous influence in the Middle East without having to risk their own forces.
North Star. So when you kind of draw back the strategy for the Middle East, the U.S. wants energy. It wants a stable Middle East. And the way to do that, at least when I look at it from the outside, this is not something that I know for a fact. The depictions I gave you are very much based on what I talk to senior officials in Israel and also the facts that you see on the ground. I think America wants to prevent a winner-take-all dynamic in the Middle East. It wants to see an equilibrium shaping up, call it Saudi, Emirates, Israel axis, Qatar, Turkey, maybe Egypt axis. And that sort of keeps the Middle East at a point of equilibrium, as opposed to the dynamics that I think of many experts in the world. You have very intimate knowledge of that dynamic, what happened in Iraq, right? When Iraq kind of collapsed and imploded, suddenly you created that
So Dan Senor worked for the George W. Bush administration with regard to the Iraq occupation.
vacuum where Iran stepped in and became a very prominent actor. I think, if I have to speculate, America doesn't want to see a winner-take-all dynamic, and that means curbing Israel. We may not like it, but if that's the rationale, it means you also curb Israel while you build the alliance of the Abrahamic Accords and try to expand that into Saudi Arabia, potentially Indonesia.
So what are the counterforces here then to this Qatar, Turkey, new Hamas, neo-Hamas, Hamas 4.0, whatever you want to call it, alliance?
So I think on one hand, you have this evolving Hamas side. You have Turkey, you have Qatar, who are going to push very strongly on the diplomatic arena against Israel. We'll see it front and center. This is going to, I think, intensify. But Turkey and that axis also has a lot of weaknesses. On the other side are the Emirates, Saudi, Israel. I would even say India. We saw Turkey being staunch public supporter of Pakistan in the flare-up in July in ways that were hard for me to reconcile. I mean, why would Erdogan, jump into that pool? I mean, he has enough issues to deal with right now, and that was not well received in New Delhi. Right, so I would even say there's this sort of India side.
They're in trouble in New Delhi. Meanwhile, disinterested national security analyst Richard Spencer has this critique of Turkey.
I will make no bones about it. I truly despise the Turks. I absolutely would support a unified European effort to take back that near Asia entirely. And whatever happens to the Turks, I don't give a shit. I don't care about them. They're ugly and just appalling people who have no culture. I've visited Turkey. I had been there, and I began to just despise those people. We have this beautiful, like Hagia Sophia and so on. It's imprisoned with this disgusting mosque, just this repulsive religion of Islam. it is a appalling place. It is an occupied territory. We should just take it from them. I don't give a flying fuck about the destiny of the Turkish people. We should rip Constantinople, entire Near Asia from them. We should throw every Turk into the ocean. I do not care about them. We should reestablish Byzantium. That is the absolute crown jewel of our civilization. That is just as important as Rome. That is just as important as Germany. That is just as important as France, London. That is our land. The white race should unify. I will only be satisfied. I will only know that the white race is back, that we are once again a powerful people when we unify and take back all of Eurasia. When I just think about the fact that Turks are, occupying that land, that they have surrounded one of the great monuments of our civilization with these stupid minarets, and there's all this shit, it just makes me entirely angry.
Okay, let's cleanse the palate a little bit more here from Helen Andrews.
Designed by women according to feminist principles. And I observe how those courts played out in practice. And I think, well, gosh, these Title IX courts for sexual assault on college campuses were just railroading a lot of innocent guys who got caught up in ambiguous situations. So there were many injustices committed by these courts. They don't seem to have the safeguards that I think are really important. These were courts designed to believe women and protect women, and yet they tended to do more harm than good. And then during the Me Too movement, what we saw, certainly in America, was many of those same legal principles and habits from the campus courts that existed on universities being applied to actual legal cases of sexual assault prosecutions in the real grown-up courts, things like the Harvey Weinstein trial and all the rest of it. And there was a tendency in those Me Too cases, certainly in how they were covered in the press, and even a little bit how they were dealt with in courts of law, that seemed to me to be inching closer and closer to.
So the governor of California, Gavin Newsom, right, his wife was an actress, and she was one of the people who had sex with Harvey Weinstein, presumably to advance her career. Right. How much pride would you have in your spouse in that sort of circumstance?
To the problems and the pathologies that were observable in the Title IX courts for sexual assault on college campuses. So that's a case where I am just observing as a fact about the world that I can see with my own eyes that increasingly feminized legal areas or types of courts tend to function in ways that I don't like, that I think are bad. To be clear, there are some people who thought the Title IX courts on college campuses were great, who thought they were pillars of feminism. They were really sad when President Trump got rid of them. But I think they were bad. I think they were kangaroo courts. And I think if our actual legal system comes to resemble them, that will be really bad for America and for anybody who has to live under the rule of law. So that's my position. Margaret Thatcher, among her many strengths, was parliamentary repartee. She could take heckling with the best of them. She would not break down and cry or give an emotional response when somebody shouted something from across the other side. So we can't say that women are bad at parliamentary debate or that they can't deal with or can't handle heckling, because Margaret Thatcher was quite good at it. Nevertheless, if you have a parliament that is majority female, the House of Commons is not majority female at this time, not yet. It probably will be someday. But if you have a parliament in which women have 1/3 representation or greater, your style of debate will become more feminized, and that will be less friendly to. But what is good for democracy? What is good for the country? And having thought about it and attempted to be objective, I think it's true that the old Ramoksha style of debate was better able to handle conflict. Another example is university departments. There are lots of people who look at English departments now or history departments now, and they say it's great that history departments are focusing more on traditionally female lines of inquiry. We do more social history now and feminist history now, talking about ordinary people. And we don't do so much military history or kings and queens anymore. That's the old stuff. And I think that the rise of women in history departments has been a big factor in that change. But I look at the kind of social history that these departments produce and I think, well, this is not actually very good. And I think that if you have history departments that don't have any respect for military history or traditionally male fields of history, that's bad. And I will stand on this position resolutely. I think that is not just a matter of my own personal preference of the kinds of history that I like to read, but I think that's, objectively true of history departments in general. We have lost something if history departments become feminized, when parliamentary debate becomes feminized, when all of these things become feminized. The institutions just don't work as well.
The big question, I think, Helen Andrews, and the one I want to conclude with is, what do we do about it? So let's just say we're with you on the proposition that you observe this shift. If you want to get back to a more rational or different way of being, I guess there are two options. One is that you reverse.
Well, Helen's point is that you simply take your thumb off the scale. You simply stop enforcing civil rights legislation in a way that makes masculinity increasingly dubious and creates liability for the employer, but increasing feminization of the workplace doesn't carry with it the same liability. You stop putting your thumb on the scale, and then society will even itself out. So I grew up in one of those rare religions that was essentially founded by a woman. Ellen G. White would have these visions that would just happen to ratify whatever it was that the Seventh-day Adventist church leaders had decided upon, right? The male leaders of the religion would come to a collective decision, and then she'd be transported to heaven and have a divine vision, and it would ratify whatever it was that the men decided. And she was a heavy drinker, but she would write passionately against alcohol. She would eat meat, and she would passionately promote vegetarianism. She functioned essentially as a repressive Talmud. She published dozens of books. She was a heavy plagiarist. My experience of Ellen G. White in my Seventh-day Adventist upbringing was not a positive one, so I do retain a little bit of a chip on my shoulder vis-a-vis Ellen White and the whole feminization of my upbringing. Seventh-day Adventist Church is about the most feminine Protestant church that you could imagine. It's a church that's more than 2/3 women. It's all about nurturing and the female gifts. It tends to look quite askance on masculine desire for competition, right? Competition was a dirty word in this religion. So I got raised in this very heavily female, feminine ethos of a religion. And then when I finally arrived at public school in 10th grade, right, feminization was pretty heavy there. And let's just say there weren't a lot of military strategy, military history courses at any of the schools I attended, right? There weren't strong masculine virtues in the schools that I attended as the dominant virtues by and large. And so I wandered in the world, and I found myself at home in traditional Orthodox Judaism, masculine, patriarchal, abundant space for men to be with men, bloke with blokes, right? The more open, rambunctious behavior and discourse that happens when men are just with men. I am so grateful for that change in my life, right? I was not at home in a highly feminine, female ethos-dominated Seventh-day Adventism. I was not at home in a female-dominated secular education system. I like being with blokes, right? I want to spend most of my spare time with blokes, right? It's just easier to communicate. You can just be more open, more honest. There are just fewer obstacles to navigate, right? Good old blokes. Big fan of the blokes. What can I say? Talk to you later, mate. Bye-bye.